Welcome, to the Cursed Hour, where every whisper in the dark, every creak in the floor, might be something watching threes. If you found this channel, you're already part of the curse. The shadow of Wrigley. The kitchen was deathly still, a mother's silence heavier than any words could bear. A father vanished into the night, his suitcase swallowed by the vast unknown. In Wrigley, a faded photo unveiled a woman lost to the marshes, her scream frozen in time. A hidden tape held his father's voice, unraveling tales of unseen terrors in the wild. Something lurked in Canada's wilderness, guarding secrets too dark to unearth. In the sweltering August of 1995, 19-year-old Ethan stumbled through the front door of his Portland home, his head throbbing from a house party where he'd tasted his first real brush with alcohol. The house was unnaturally quiet, a stillness that prickled his skin like a warning. He expected his mother and sister to be out, perhaps at the store or visiting neighbors, but as he crossed the threshold into the kitchen, he found his mother at the table, a glass of wine untouched, her face etched with grief. She never drank during the day, never sat so motionless, her eyes hollow as if she'd stared into an abyss. The sight jolted him, his hangover amplifying the unease that curled in his chest. Dread coiled like a living thing as she asked him to sit, her voice barely above a whisper. Her words came slow, each one a stone dropped into still water. "Your dad's gone," she whispered. "He's not coming back." "Not dead," she clarified when Ethan's voice cracked with the question. "Just gone." He'd packed a suitcase, climbed into his car, and driven off into a void, leaving no note, no reason, no trace. Ethan's mind reeled, relief at his father's survival fleeting before shock pulled him under. He bombarded her with questions. Where? When? How? But she had no answers, her attempts to respond dissolving into tears. Ethan held her as she sobbed, promising it would be okay. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't. The kitchen, once a place of laughter, felt like a tomb, sealing their family's fracture in silence. For months, the absence of Ethan's father was a wound no one dared touch. Relatives called, their voices soft with concern, and visited with casseroles and forced smiles. But the conversation skirted the mystery. They asked about Ethan's job, Lila's school, his mother's health, anything but why his father had left or if he'd return. His mother's silence grew volatile, tears or rage whenever Ethan mentioned his dad. "He's dead to me," she'd snarl, her voice a blade, slamming doors or collapsing into cries that echoed through the house. Ethan sensed a secret buried beneath her anger, a truth she guarded with ferocity. Her outbursts confirmed she knew something, perhaps not the full story, but enough to fuel her bitterness. His grief, once a dull ache, hardened into a burning curiosity, a need to unravel the why behind his father's flight. He couldn't sit idle, not when the silence was so loud. Ethan reached out to Carl, his father's only friend, a man who'd known him since college, longer than his mother had. Carl's voice was heavy with surprise. He hadn't heard from Ethan's father, had no clue why he'd left. But he mentioned Wrigley, a remote town in Canada's Northwest Territories, where his father had spent a college summer, reminiscing about it with a longing that hinted at escape. Carl's words were a spark, igniting Ethan's resolve. He checked Portland, his father hadn't been to work, and Lincoln City, his hometown, but found no trace. Wrigley, a 30-hour drive through desolate wilderness, became his last hope, a beacon in the fog of his father's absence. Wrigley was a speck on the map, a town of 100 souls, mostly First Nation, nestled in the wilds of Canada's Northwest Territories. It had one gas station, one medical clinic, and an RCMP office 200 miles away. A place so small it seemed to exist outside time. Its isolation was Ethan's ally. There'd be nowhere for his father to hide. Ethan arrived in July 1997, his beat-up sedan his only shelter. His funds too tight for motels after the grueling drive from Portland. The air was crisp, the town's quiet a stark contrast to the city's hum. At the gas station, Winston, a weathered man in his 40s with a kind smile, greeted him, noting how rare outsiders were. Ethan showed a recent photo of his father, but Winston shook his head, his eyes scanning the image with no flicker of recognition. Desperate, Ethan dug through his father's old belongings, pulling out a second picture, a college-aged man beside a young woman, both in hiking gear, standing by a massive rock formation. Winston's eyes narrowed. The woman resembled Susan Culver, missing since 1973 near Great Bear Lake. He recognized the rock as Hunter's Rock, a local landmark 10 miles out, tied to legends of a giant hunter's spear or a meteorite buried deep in the earth. Winston's voice grew heavy as he suggested Ethan visit Chief Irwin at the clinic to confirm Susan's identity, his words carrying the weight of a town that remembered its ghosts. Hunter's Rock had been a point of contention in Wrigley during the 1980s, when geologists from Vancouver descended to study it, stirring a clash between science and tradition. Local lore painted it as the spear of a mythical hunter, or perhaps a meteorite that had plunged from the stars. The geologists found neither, but their measurements suggested the rock extended nearly a mile into the earth, a geological anomaly with no clear origin unless the area was an extinct volcano, a theory that didn't hold. Ethan puzzled over his father's presence there. Geology had never been his passion. If his father had known Susan, her disappearance might explain his sudden flight, a thread connecting past to present. Winston's mention of Susan Culver sent Ethan's thoughts spiraling. Could her fate be the key to his father's vanishing? At the town's clinic, Chief Irwin, a warm man whose ceremonial title belied his modest office, welcomed Ethan with a smile that faded when shown the old photo. His face turned cold as he revealed Susan Culver, a King's University graduate who vanished in the Sahu lands, and his father had been a suspect, questioned twice by the RCMP. The revelation was a thunderbolt, shattering Ethan's image of his father, yet it was progress, the first solid lead after 18 months of dead ends. Ethan's mind raced, theorizing his father's departure was a pilgrimage to resolve old guilt or grief over Susan, a wound that had festered for decades. Susan Culver's story was a wound in Wrigley's memory. Her campsite, found abandoned in the Sau lands near Great Bear Lake, was pristine. No signs of struggle, no blood, just an eerie stillness that baffled the RCMP. Irwin hadn't seen Ethan's father recently, but noted Hunter's Rock's proximity to the lake, suggesting he might have bypassed Wrigley to confront his past directly. Reaching the site meant a 200-mile drive to DeLine and a 30-mile hike through treacherous marshes, beyond Ethan's means. His bank account was nearly empty, drained by gas, motels, and road food, and he'd already taken a week off work. Quitting the search seemed the only option, but the thought of living with regret was unbearable. Ethan felt his father's presence in Wrigley, a ghost just out of reach, urging him to press on. Winston, moved by Ethan's determination, offered to drive him to DeLine for the cost of gas, but his warning cut deep. If your dad's looking for her, and you're looking for him, who's looking for you? The words were a cold blade, a reminder of the wilderness's indifference. Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. But Winston's question lingered, a shadow cast over the path ahead, hinting at dangers he couldn't yet fathom. Ethan's return to Portland was like stepping into a house that no longer felt like home. The familiar creak of the front door, the worn kitchen table where his mother had broken the news of his father's departure. All seemed alien now, tainted by the secrets he'd uncovered in Wrigley. The cassette tape, now a sacred relic, sat on his desk, its label smudged, but its weight eternal. He handled it with care, as if it might crumble, its hissing static a portal to his father's past. He played it sparingly, fearing the tape might snap. Each listen deepening the mystery of they. The word was a splinter in his mind, vague yet heavy with dread. Was it madness, guilt, or something real that his father had glimpsed in the Sahu lands? Ethan's nights were fractured, sleep stolen by dreams of marshes that swallowed him whole. Susan Culver's scream blending with his father's frantic voice. He woke with her name on his lips, a stranger who'd become his guide to a father he barely knew. Lila, his 16-year-old sister, noticed his drift, her eyes searching his with a quiet worry that cut deeper than their mother's rage. "Do you think Dad's okay?" she asked, her voice small, breaking Ethan's heart. He lied, claiming he was close to answers, but the truth was a chasm he couldn't cross. The tape painted a man haunted, not just by Susan's loss, but by something he couldn't name. Ethan's mother, meanwhile, had hardened into a fortress of silence, her gaze avoiding his, her anger a wall he couldn't breach. One evening, he tried mentioning Susan, hoping to crack her defenses, but she snapped. "Don't you dare bring that up!" Her fury was a flare, confirming she held a piece of the puzzle, perhaps not the full picture, but enough to fuel her bitterness. Ethan retreated to his room, the tape his only solace. He transcribed every word, every pause, searching for hidden meaning, but found only a man unraveling under the weight of what he'd seen. Work became a haze, a means to an end. Ethan's manager, kind but concerned, noticed his distraction, but Ethan pushed through, saving every paycheck for a return to Deline. He spent breaks poring over maps of Great Bear Lake, tracing paths through the marshes he couldn't yet walk. The Sau lands loomed in his mind, a labyrinth of mud and mosquitoes, promising answers, but threatening to take more than it gave. Winston's warning echoed relentlessly. "Who's looking for you?" It wasn't just about finding his father, it was about surviving the wilderness's indifference. Ethan wrote to Carl, his father's friend, hoping for new leads, but Carl's replies were thin, tinged with pity, offering no fresh clues. Susan Culver became Ethan's anchor, a tether to his father's past, a key to the silence that had shattered his family. He scoured his father's old belongings again, old shirts, a worn wallet, faded receipts, but found nothing new, only the ghost of a man who'd left them behind. The tape's words, "They took her," were a call he couldn't ignore, pulling him north. Ethan began researching the Northwest Territories, diving into library stacks for books on First Nation lore. He found fragments about the Sau lands, sacred grounds where spirits walked, where the veil between worlds was thin. One tale spoke of a hiker lured by voices into the mist, his gear left untouched, never seen again. The parallels to Susan's disappearance and his father's flight were too precise, too unsettling. Ethan pushed the thought away, clinging to logic, but doubt crept in like fog. What if his father had seen something real, something the Mounties couldn't fathom? He wrote to Chief Irwin, asking about recent sightings, But Erwin's reply was brief. No trace of his father. Only a somber note about the Sahu land's reputation. "Some places don't let go," Erwin wrote. His words a warning Ethan couldn't shake. The tape, the lore, the silence, it all wove a web around Ethan, binding him to a mystery that refused to unravel. Spring 1998 found Ethan. A man divided, half in Portland's gray routine, half in Wrigley's shadow. The cassette tape, its edges fraying from use, was a relic of a father he barely recognized. He'd memorized every tremor in his father's voice, every frantic pause, hunting for clues in the static. They haunted him, a word heavy with meaning beyond madness. Ethan's days blurred. Work, sleep, research, his life narrowing to the pursuit of truth. He scoured online forums, primitive in the late 90s, finding whispers of the Sau lands, hikers lost, voices in the fog, campsites left untouched. One post described a trapper's dog vanishing, mirroring Mackenzie's tale of the RCMP hound. The pattern: Susan, the dog, perhaps his father, felt alive, a pulse beneath the marsh's surface. Ethan saved the post, its anonymity adding to its weight. His mother's silence grew unbearable, a wall he couldn't scale. One night, after another failed attempt to mention Susan, she threw a plate, screaming, "He left us! That's all you need to know!" Her outburst was a flare, illuminating her pain, but obscuring the truth. Ethan retreated, his resolve hardening. He planned a return to DeLine, saving for gear, a 4x4, boots, a tent, tools to face the wilderness. The Sahu lands called, a dangerous promise of truth. He wrote to Erwin again, who sent old photos of Wrigley, none showing his father. The absence was louder than any clue. Ethan's dreams turned darker, marshes swallowing him. Voices not his father's, but Susan's, calling from the fog. He woke, gasping, the tape's words ringing. She couldn't survive what they were doing. Lila's worry grew, her questions sharper. "You're going back, aren't you?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded, unable to lie to her. He promised to be careful, but the Sahu lands loomed larger than his assurances. He trained for the hike, running trails until his lungs burned, testing his endurance against the wilderness's cruelty. He bought a map, marking DeLine and the Sahu lands, calculating routes through the marshes. The cost was daunting. Gear, time off, gas, but regret was heavier. He called Winston, who promised to help again, his voice warm but cautious. "You sure you want to chase this ghost?" Ethan wasn't sure, but stopping felt like abandoning his father, Susan, and himself. The mystery of they was a knot he had to untangle, no matter the cost. Ethan's research deepened, moving beyond lore to RCMP records. He filed a Freedom of Information request for Susan's case, knowing it could take months. The tape suggested a man haunted, not just by loss, but by something he couldn't name. He read about missing hikers, their stories eerily similar to Susan's. A pristine campsite, no trace, no answers. One detail stuck, a hunter's journal, found years later, mentioning eyes in the fog. Ethan's skin prickled. It echoed his father's they. He wrote to Mackenzie, asking about recent disappearances. But Mackenzie's reply was curt. No new leads, only a warning to stay safe. Ethan's obsession grew. The tape his only lifeline, its words a call to the north that he couldn't ignore. By summer 1998, Ethan's resolve was ironclad. He bought a used 4x4, its engine rumbling with promise, a symbol of his commitment. The cassette tape, carefully copied to preserve the original, was his compass, guiding him back to DeLine. He mapped the Sahu lands, marking Susan's campsite, every detail etched in memory. He contacted Mackenzie, who reported no sightings but shared a new lead, a hunter's tale of strange lights in the marshes, flickering like will-o'-the-wisps. Ethan's pulse quickened. It felt like a sign, a breadcrumb in the wilderness. He wrote to Winston, who offered lodging in Wrigley, his voice heavy with concern. "You're chasing more than your dad," Winston warned. "Be sure you're ready." Ethan's training intensified. Backpacking, navigation, survival skills honed on Oregon's rugged trails. The wilderness was no myth. It was a predator, ancient and unforgiving. He read about DeLine's history, tales of trappers and spirits woven into the land. One story spoke of a watcher in the marshes, seen by few, named by none. Ethan dismissed it, but the cassette's "they" lingered, a shadow in his thoughts. He packed gear, tent, boots, rations, each item a shield against the unknown. Lila helped, her quiet support a balm against his mother's silence. "Don't get lost," she said, her voice small, her eyes pleading. Ethan promised, but the Sahu lands whispered otherwise, their call stronger than his sister's fear. His mother's thaw was slow, her anger giving way to resignation. One night, she touched his hand, whispering, "He loved you." It was the closest she'd come to acknowledging the past, but Susan's name remained a forbidden word. Ethan respected her silence, focusing on his plan. He wrote a letter to her, explaining his intent to return to DeLine, promising to come back. The letter sat unsent, a weight in his drawer, a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. He contacted Irwin, arranging a guide in DeLine, someone familiar with the marshes. The cost was steep: gear, gas, time off. But Ethan's savings were enough. Barely. The Sahu lands were no longer a distant dream. They were a challenge he had to face. Ethan's nights were consumed by preparation. He studied the tape's transcript, searching for missed clues, but they remained elusive. He read Mackenzie's last letter, mentioning a new missing hiker near Great Bear Lake, their gear abandoned like Susan's. The pattern, Susan, the dog. Now this felt like a warning, a pulse beneath the earth. Ethan's resolve flickered, but held. He vowed to leave a trail, notes, maps, contacts, to ensure someone would look for him. The cassette tape was his anchor, his father's voice a call to action. He was ready, or as ready as he could be, to face the shadow of Wrigley and whatever it hid. June 1998 arrived, and Ethan was as prepared as he'd ever be. He packed his 4x4, the cassette tape tucked safely in his bag, a talisman against the unknown. His mother, softer now, sent money without argument, her eyes betraying a fear she couldn't voice. "Come back," she whispered, her hand gripping his, a plea that hung heavy in the air. Ethan promised, but the Sahu lands loomed larger than home, their call drowning out her words. He left Portland at dawn, the road stretching north like a lifeline, each mile pulling him closer to Wrigley. The wilderness was a vast canvas, its silence a warning of what lay ahead. The drive was a test of endurance. 31 hours through forests and mountains, the 4x4's engine a steady hum. Ethan stopped only for gas and coffee, the tape's words looping in his mind. "They took her," his father had said, his voice raw with terror. He passed small towns, their lights fading into the dark, the world shrinking to the road and his mission. Wrigley's gas station appeared like a beacon, Winston's familiar figure standing in the doorway. The reunion was warm, but Winston's eyes held worry. "You're going deeper this time, aren't you?" Ethan nodded, unfolding his map, tracing the route to DeLine. Winston shook his head, his voice low. "Those marshes don't forgive mistakes." They drove to DeLine, the journey filled with Winston's tales of Wrigley's past, hunters lost, spirits glimpsed in the fog. Winston's voice dropped. "The Sahu lands don't belong to us. They never did." Ethan felt the weight of his words, a chill settling in his bones. In DeLine, the RCMP office was unchanged, Mackenzie grayer, but still sharp. No trace of Ethan's father. But Mackenzie shared a new detail, a hiker's journal found years after Susan, mentioning eyes in the fog. The phrase echoed his father's "they," sending a shiver down Ethan's spine. He bought gear in DeLine, extra rations, a better tent, each purchase a step toward the unknown. Mackenzie's warning was stark. "You go out there, you might not come back." Ethan nodded, the cassette's call louder than fear. The trailhead to the Sau lands was a narrow path, swallowed by towering pines. Ethan stood alone, the tape's words echoing. "They took her." He checked his gear, his map, his resolve. The marshes waited, a labyrinth of mud and mystery, promising answers, but threatening to take everything. Winston clapped his shoulder, his voice heavy. "I'll be here when you get back." Ethan stepped forward, the wilderness closing around him, its silence a challenge he couldn't refuse. The shadow of Wrigley was no longer a distant memory. It was his path, his fate. The Sahu lands were a nightmare from the first step. Mud sucked at Ethan's boots. Mosquitoes swarmed in relentless clouds, the air thick with the stench of decay. He moved alone, his breath the only sound in a silence that felt alive. Watchful. The cassette's words looped in his head, his father's voice a lifeline in the wilderness. The trail was faint, overgrown, each mile a battle against the land's indifference. He carried the tape in his pack, its weight a reminder of why he was here. The marshes stretched endless, a maze of water and reeds, hiding secrets Ethan wasn't sure he wanted to find. On the second day, exhaustion set in, his legs heavy, his pack a burden. He found a clearing, eerily pristine, like Susan's campsite described in Irwin's tales. No trace of his father, no signs of life, but the air felt wrong, heavy, as if eyes watched from the fog. Ethan set camp, the night alive with rustles and whispers, nothing human. He clutched the tape, playing it softly, his father's voice cutting through the dark. "They took her," it said, raw and desperate. Ethan's fire flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move, to watch. He slept fitfully, dreaming of Susan's scream, of they lurking just beyond the light. The third day brought no answers, only more marsh. Ethan pressed on, the tape's words his only guide, his father's fear a map to the unknown. He found no footprints, no camps, no sign his father had ever been here. The clearing haunted him, its stillness a warning he couldn't heed. Ethan's resolve wavered, Winston's words ringing. "Who's looking for you?" He left markers, tied cloth, carved trees, to ensure a return. The Sahu lands were no place for the unprepared. and Ethan feared he was one of them. Yet the tape pulled him forward, its mystery a call he couldn't ignore, a shadow he had to chase. Ethan's return to Portland did little to dull the pull of Wrigley's mysteries. The city's hum, traffic, chatter, the clink of coffee cups felt alien after the silence of the Northwest Territories. His mother's volatile silence, once a barrier, now seemed a mirror of his own turmoil, tears or rage whenever he mentioned his father. The cassette tape, carefully stored in a locked drawer, was a constant presence, its words etched into his memory. "They took her," his father had said, his voice raw with a fear that Ethan now felt creeping into his own bones. He replayed the tape sparingly, fearing it might degrade. But each listen deepened the enigma. Who or what were they? A delusion born of guilt, or something real that had driven his father from home? Ethan's apartment, a cramped studio above a noisy diner, became a shrine to his search. Maps of Great Bear Lake pinned to the walls, books on First Nation lore stacked precariously, and a notebook filled with scribbled theories. Lila, his sister, was his only tether to normalcy. Her visits were brief, her questions sharp yet soft. "Do you think Dad's okay?" she asked, her eyes searching his, desperate for hope. Ethan lied, offering vague assurances, but the truth was a void. The tape painted a man haunted, not just by Susan's loss, but by something he couldn't name. He scoured online forums, a new frontier in 1998, finding threads about the Sahu lands, hikers vanishing, voices in the fog, campsites left untouched. One post, buried in an obscure board, mentioned a trapper's dog disappearing, echoing Mackenzie's story of the RCMP hound. The coincidence chilled him, a pattern emerging from the wilderness's silence. Ethan wrote to Chief Irwin, hoping for updates. But Irwin's reply was kind, yet empty. No sightings of his father. Only a photo of Wrigley's gas station, a reminder of Winston's warmth. The absence of clues was louder than any lead. A scream in the quiet. Ethan's job at a hardware store was a grind, his focus fractured by thoughts of Deline. He spent breaks sketching routes to the Sao lands, calculating costs for a 4x4 and gear. The marshes loomed in his mind, a labyrinth of mud and secrets. Winston's warning, "Who's looking for you?" was a constant echo, urging caution. Ethan began training, running Portland's trails until his lungs burned, testing his endurance against the wilderness's imagined trials. He bought a used backpack, filling it with weights to simulate a trek, each step a defiance of his fear. The Sahu lands weren't just a place, they were a challenge, daring him to uncover what took Susan, and maybe his father. He contacted Carl again, but Carl's letters grew sparse, tinged with pity, offering no new insights. Susan Culver was Ethan's anchor, her disappearance a thread binding him to his father's past. His mother's softening was subtle, a touch on his arm, a quieter sigh when he mentioned his plans. One evening, she whispered, "He loved you," her voice breaking, the closest she'd come to truth. Susan's name remained unspoken, a forbidden key Ethan couldn't turn. He respected her silence, focusing on his mission. The cassette tape was his compass, guiding him north, its words a call he couldn't ignore. Ethan's dreams grew vivid, marshes swallowing him, a woman's scream mingling with his father's voice. He woke with a start, the word "they" on his lips, a shadow that refused to fade. By late summer 1998, Ethan's life was a dual existence, Portland's routine and Wrigley's pull. The cassette tape, its edges fraying, was a relic of a father he barely recognized. He'd memorized every tremor, every pause, searching for meaning. They was no longer just a word. It was a presence, something his father had seen, something that drove him away. Ethan scoured libraries, finding Northwest territories. Lore, tales of the Sau lands as a place where spirits lingered, where the earth held grudges. One story spoke of a hiker lured by voices, vanishing into the mist, his gear untouched. The parallels to Susan's fate and his father's flight were uncanny. Ethan pushed the supernatural aside, clinging to logic, but doubt crept in. What if his father had encountered something beyond reason? His mother's wall remained unbreached. One night, after mentioning Susan, she threw a plate, screaming, "He left us! That's all you need to know!" Her outburst fueled Ethan's resolve. He began planning a return to Deline, saving every penny for gear and time off. The Sau lands called, a dangerous promise of truth. He wrote to Irwin, who shared more about Susan's case, her campsite. Pristine, a riddle without answers. Irwin's voice was heavy. Some places don't let go. Ethan's dreams darkened. Marshes pulling him under, voices whispering his name. He woke, gasping, the tape's words ringing. She couldn't survive what they were doing. Ethan contacted Winston, whose reply was warm but cautious. "You sure you want to chase this ghost?" Winston asked, promising to help again. Ethan wasn't sure, but stopping felt like betrayal. The mystery of his father, Susan, and they was a knot he had to untangle. He trained harder, running trails, testing his limits. The wilderness was no myth. It was a predator, ancient and unforgiving. He read about missing hikers, their stories mirroring Susan's. A detail stuck, a search dog vanishing. Like Mackenzie's tale, the Sau lands took more than they gave. Ethan's resolve wavered, but the tape pulled him back. His father's voice, raw with fear, was a call he couldn't ignore. He began mapping the trek, marking Deline and the Sioux lands. The cost was steep, 4x4 tent, rations, but regret was heavier. Ethan bought a used sleeping bag, testing it in his backyard, imagining the marsh's chill. Lila's quiet support was a balm. "Don't get lost," she said, her voice small. Ethan promised, but the Sau lands whispered otherwise. The cassette tape was his guide, its words a beacon in the dark, urging him north. Fall 1998 brought a sharper focus. Ethan's savings grew, each paycheck a step toward Deline. The cassette tape, copied to preserve the original, was his compass. He bought a used 4x4, its engine a rumble of promise. He mapped the Sau lands, marking Susan's campsite, every detail etched in memory. Ethan contacted Mackenzie, who reported no sightings, but shared a new lead, a hunter's tale of strange lights in the marshes. Ethan's pulse quickened. It felt like a sign. He wrote to Winston, who offered lodging in Wrigley. "You're chasing more than your dad," Winston warned. "Be ready." Ethan's training intensified. Backpacking, navigation, survival skills. The wilderness was a force, ancient and indifferent. He read Deline's history, tales of trappers and spirits. One story spoke of a watcher in the marshes, seen by few, named by none. Ethan dismissed it, but the tapes they lingered. He packed gear, tent, boots, rations, each item a shield. Lila helped, her support a quiet strength. "Come back," she said, echoing their mother's plea. Ethan nodded, but the Sahu lands loomed larger. The cassette tape was his anchor, its words a vow to uncover the truth. His mother's thaw continued, subtle but real. She touched his hand one night, whispering, "Be careful." Susan remained unspoken, a wound too raw. Ethan respected her silence, focusing on his plan. He trained until his body ached, preparing for the marsh's cruelty. The Sahu lands were no mere destination. They were a test. Winston's warning, "Who's looking for you?" was a constant refrain, urging him to leave a trail. Notes, maps, anything to ensure his return. Winter. Yate passed in a blur of preparation. Ethan's 4x4 was ready, its tires tested on rough trails. The cassette tape, a voice from the past, drove him forward. He wrote a letter to his mother, explaining his plan, promising to return. Her silence was heavy, but she hugged him, a rare gesture. Ethan contacted Irwin, arranging a guide in DeLine. The Sahu lands were his destiny, a call he couldn't ignore. He read Mackenzie's last letter, mentioning a new missing hiker near Great Bear Lake. The pattern, Susan, the dog, now this, felt alive, pulling him north. He left Portland in June 1999, the road a familiar friend. Wrigley's gas station greeted him, Winston's smile warm but wary. They drove to DeLine, the marshes closer now. Ethan stood at the trailhead, the cassette's words echoing. They took her. The wilderness stretched before him, a maze of mud and mystery. He felt his father's presence, a ghost urging him forward. But Winston's warning lingered. "Who's looking for you?" Ethan checked his gear, map, compass, rations, a lifeline against the unknown. The Sahu lands weren't just a place, they were a force, daring him to step inside. The trek began with a weight Ethan hadn't anticipated. The cassette tape, tucked in his pack, was a talisman, its words a guide. Mud sucked at his boots, mosquitoes a relentless swarm. He moved alone, the silence broken only by his breath and the tape's echoes in his mind. The marshes were a nightmare, each step a battle against the earth's grip. Ethan's thoughts drifted to Susan, her scream frozen in his father's voice, a warning of what lay ahead. On the second day, he found a clearing, eerily pristine, like Susan's campsite. No trace of his father, but the air felt wrong, heavy with unseen eyes. He camped, the night alive with rustles, nothing human. The tape's words, "They took her," were a mantra, driving him deeper. Vowing answers or nothing at all. The marshes of the Sahu lands were a relentless adversary, their mud clinging to Ethan's boots like a living thing. Each step a battle against the earth's will. The cassette tape, tucked safely in his pack, was a talisman, its words a guide through the wilderness's oppressive silence. Mosquitoes swarmed, a buzzing cloud that tested his sanity, their bites a constant sting against his exposed skin. By the fourth day, Ethan's body ached, his gear heavier with every mile, but his resolve burned brighter. He moved alone, the silence broken only by his breath and the tape's echoes in his mind. The marshes stretched endlessly, a labyrinth of reeds and stagnant water, their surface rippling under an unseen force. Ethan's thoughts drifted to Susan, her scream frozen in his father's voice, a warning of what lay ahead. The clearing he'd found on the third day haunted him. It was too perfect, grass untouched, no sign of animals or wind. As if time had paused, no trace of his father. but the air felt wrong, heavy with unseen eyes. Ethan returned to it, drawn by an instinct he couldn't name. He set up camp again, his tent a frail shield against the night's unknowns. The tape's words, "They took her," were a mantra, driving him deeper into the mystery. As darkness fell, the marshes came alive with sounds, rustles in the reeds, whispers that weren't the wind. Ethan gripped his flashlight, its beam slicing through the fog, revealing nothing but more fog. He clutched the tape, his father's voice a lifeline, vowing answers or nothing at all. A twig snapped nearby, sharp and deliberate, but no shadow followed. His father's frantic words echoed, "How do you not know? You live here." Ethan's heart raced, the clearing no longer a refuge but a stage. Watched by something he couldn't see, he searched the clearing's edges, finding faint marks in the mud, too vague to be footprints, yet too ordered to be natural. The Sahu lands held secrets, and Ethan felt their weight pressing down. He recalled Mackenzie's tale of the missing RCMP dog, its disappearance a mirror to Susan's. What took them? Ethan's notebook filled with sketches of the clearing, notes on the sounds, theories about they. The tape suggested his father had seen something real, not madness. Ethan's fire crackled, its light pushing back the dark, but the whispers grew bolder, circling his camp. He wondered if his father had stood here, facing the same unseen presence, driven to flee or worse. Sleep was impossible, the night a gauntlet of unseen eyes and unheard voices. On the 5th day, Ethan pushed deeper, the clearing now a fixed point in his mental map. The cassette tape, a voice from the past, drove him forward. The marshes grew denser, the air thicker, as if resisting his intrusion. He felt his father's presence, a ghost urging him on, but Winston's warning lingered. "Who's looking for you?" Ethan's gear was sodden, his rations dwindling, but surrender wasn't an option. The tape's words, "She couldn't survive what they were doing," were a fire in his chest, burning away doubt. He navigated by compass, the marshes defying logic, paths looping back on themselves. The Sahu lands weren't just a place, they were a force, ancient and unforgiving, near a stagnant pool. Ethan spotted something unnatural, a glint of leather in the mud. He knelt, prying free a small, waterlogged journal. Its pages brittle but intact. The tape's echo, "They took her," seemed to hum as he opened it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, faded but legible. Dated 1974, a year after Susan's disappearance. The writer, a hunter named Elias, described lights in the marshes, like eyes in the fog, and whispers calling his name. Elias's last entry was frantic. "They're here! I can't run!" Ethan's breath caught. The journal mirrored his father's tape, a second witness to they. What had Elias seen? Was it the same force that took Susan? He tucked the journal into his pack, its weight heavier than its size. The discovery electrified Ethan, but fear followed close. The marshes felt alive, watching, waiting for him to stray. He marked the pool on his map, noting its proximity to the clearing. The tape's words grew louder. "How do you not know?" Ethan's flashlight flickered, batteries failing despite being new. He recalled Irwin's warning. Some places don't let go. The marshes were no mere wilderness. They were a trap, set long before his father's time. Ethan vowed to return to Deline. The journal a clue to share with Mackenzie, a bridge to his father's truth. The 6th day brought fog so thick it swallowed the sun. The cassette tape, Ethan's anchor, felt heavier, its words a chain binding him to the marshes. Visibility was near zero, the reeds ghostly shapes in the mist. He moved by instinct, the tape's echo. They took her, a guide through the haze. Ethan's boots sank deeper, the mud a greedy hand, slowing his pace. The Sahu lands were no longer a place, they were a predator, stalking him. He checked his compass, its needle spinning wildly, defying logic. His father's voice roared, "How do you not know? You live here!" Ethan's pulse hammered, the fog pressing against him like a living thing. A whisper broke the silence, not wind, not reeds, but a voice, low and indistinct. Ethan froze, the tape's words, "She couldn't survive," ringing in his ears. "Ethan," it called, soft but clear, mimicking Lila's voice. His heart lurched. Lila was in Portland, safe, yet the voice was hers. He swung his flashlight, its beam lost in the fog. The whisper came again, now behind him, now to his left, circling like a hunter. Ethan shouted, "Who's there?" But the fog swallowed his words. The tape's truth hit hard. His father had heard something, seen something, and it drove him away. Ethan clutched the journal, its pages a shield against the voice. The Sahu lands knew his name, just as they'd known Susan's. He pressed on, the whisper fading, but never gone. The clearing loomed in his mind, a magnet pulling him back. Ethan's rations were low, his body pushed to its limit, but the journal and tape fueled him. He imagined his father here, facing the same whispers, the same fog. The marshes tested him, each step a defiance of fear. Ethan vowed to reach Deline, to share the journal, to find they before they found him. Ethan emerged from the marshes on the 8th day, battered but unbroken. The cassette tape, his lifeline, was safe, its words a vow unfulfilled. Deline's lights were a beacon, pulling him from the fog's grip. He stumbled into the RCMP office, Mackenzie's face a mix of relief and concern. "You made it back." Ethan shared the journal, its pages trembling in his hands. Mackenzie's eyes darkened, recognizing Elias's name, another lost soul in the Sahu lands. The hunter had vanished a year after Susan, his case closed as a drowning. The tape's echo, "They took her," aligned with Elias's eyes in the fog. Mackenzie promised to investigate, but his voice held doubt. The Sahu lands kept their secrets, and Ethan was no closer to his father. Winston drove him back to Wrigley, his silence heavy. "You found more than you bargained for," he said, eyeing the journal. Ethan nodded, the marshes' whispers still in his ears. The tape's words, "How do you not know?" were a challenge, unanswered. He slept in his car, the journal beside him, its pages a map to a truth he couldn't reach. Ethan dreamed of his father, running through fog. Susan's scream trailing him. He woke with resolve, vowing to return, better prepared. The Sahu lands hadn't yielded his father, but they'd given him Elias, a clue to the shadow that bound them. Back in Portland, Ethan's life was a shadow. The cassette tape, now a sacred relic, sat on his desk, its label faded, but its weight eternal. He wrote a blog, pouring his story into words, a lifeline for his sanity. His mother read it, her silence softer, but she never spoke of Susan. Lila clung to him, her fear unspoken. "You'll find him, right?" she whispered. Ethan nodded. But the Sahu lands loomed larger than hope. The journal's words, "They're here," merged with the tapes, "They took her." A puzzle he couldn't solve. He planned another trip. The marshes a call he couldn't resist. The shadow of Wrigley stretched, its secrets binding him to a father lost, and a truth that might never be found. Ethan stood at his window, the city blind to his quest, knowing the Sahu lands waited, ready to claim him next. The silent pumps. The highway stretched into oblivion, its emptiness a lullaby for weary drivers. But the gas station's glow hid a silence that screamed of wrongness. I was bone-tired, my eyes heavy from hours behind the wheel. When I pulled off into a two-pump station lost in the middle of nowhere, I turned off the highway into a two-pump gas station in the middle of nowhere. The place looked ordinary, its neon sign flickering, promising fuel and snacks. As I drove my car up to the pump, everything seemed as normal as could be. I focused on the pump's display, pinching pennies to keep it under $30. My mind dulled by fatigue. My eyes were locked on the pump display as I filled my car up, trying my best to not go a penny over $30. The hum of the pump was the only sound. The night air still. The highways drone distant. I guess I was kind of zonked from how tired I was. It wasn't until I walked to the kiosk to pay that the world shifted. The station's quiet, not peaceful but eerie, as if it had been abandoned mid-breath. So, it was only when I walked over to the kiosk to pay that I noticed something was off. The kiosk wasn't just empty. It was a void, its glass reflecting a station that held no life, only questions. No one stood behind the counter, the register dark, the usual hum of a late-night clerk absent. The first thing that got my attention was how there was no one manning this kiosk. I waited, assuming a bathroom break, but minutes ticked by, the silence growing heavier. At first, I just waited, thinking the employee was just taking a quick bathroom break or something of that nature. Then I noticed the car at the other pump, its driver gone, the vehicle abandoned. I realized the driver of the car at the pump in front of me was nowhere to be seen either. No one was in the car or the convenience store. The lights inside dim, uninviting. They weren't in their car, and they weren't inside the convenience store. A chill crept up my spine, my mind flashing to a robbery. The clerk and driver hiding, or worse. I got this momentary chill, thinking I might have interrupted a robbery or something. I hesitated, wary of knocking, fearing I'd alert a thief. I was suddenly very hesitant to knock on the glass or call for service. The car ahead wasn't a Honda, easy to steal, but a BM harder to break into, easing my panic slightly. I remember turning to check out the car parked in front of me and thinking, if it's a Honda, then I'm getting out of here. But it looked to me like it was a 2011 3 Series. The station wasn't just deserted. It was a stage. Its silence a curtain hiding a scene I wasn't meant to see. I knocked on the kiosk's glass. Once, twice, 3 times, each rap louder. But no answer came. I knocked once and then twice, and then, after the 3rd time, I knocked in the glass, and as many minutes. The quiet was unnatural, the station's emptiness a puzzle with missing pieces. It hit me that something highly unusual was clearly going on. I tried the convenience store door, expecting it locked, but it swung open easily, creaking into darkness. My first thought was to try the door to the convenience store. I'm pretty sure it was supposed to be locked, but when I pushed, the door swung right open for me. I called out, "Hello?" My voice echoing, unanswered, as I stepped inside, heart racing. I walked up to the counter calling out, "Hello!" The whole time, thinking of a medical emergency. I vaulted the counter, checking the bathroom. Storage. Office. All empty. Unlocked. Silent. I jumped the counter and took a look around the back of the store. There was a bathroom and a storage room in a small office, but all three were unlocked and empty. The station was a ghost, its life drained without a trace. Then, and only then, did I realize that the entire gas station was completely deserted. The pumps weren't just machines, they were sentinels, their hum a dirge for secrets buried in the station's shadows. I circled the building, checking the back, finding nothing but more silence. The pump's low hum now ominous, like a heartbeat too slow. I checked around the back just to be sure, but I figured that there'd be no one there. Convinced something was deeply wrong, I pulled out my phone, fingers trembling, ready to call 911. Once I was 100% sure something seriously weird was going on, I pulled out my phone and got ready to dial 911. I shouted hello again, louder, but the void swallowed my voice. I called out hello again, but much louder. The call connected, the dispatcher skeptical, thinking I was just annoyed at a missing clerk. I called the cops. I could tell that at first anyway, that the dispatcher thought that I was just some jerk customer who was angry my gas station attendant wasn't there. I explained the station's desertion, the empty car, the open door, and her tone shifted, taking me seriously. Once I properly explained that there was literally no one to be found anywhere on the premises or elsewhere, she started to take my call a little more seriously. She asked if it looked like a robbery, and I snapped, unsure. Having checked everywhere but the dumpster, she asked where I was, and when I told her, she asked if it looked like there had been a robbery. I remember asking. How the hell would I know? I felt this sort of twinge of frustration because, like I said, I'd look probably everywhere except the dumpster around the side of the gas station. The dumpster wasn't just trash, it was a tomb. Its lid a seal on horrors I was never meant to uncover. Walking back from the highway, I passed the dumpster, a thought nagging me to check it, to tell the dispatcher I'd left no stone unturned. As I'm walking back from checking out the highway for signs of life, I just so happened to be passing it as the thought to open it popped into my head. I lifted the lid, expecting nothing, but froze as my eyes caught the contents, dropping it like it burned. When I opened the dumpster, there they were. I only caught a glimpse of what was inside before I dropped the lid of that dumpster and backed off like the thing was radioactive. 2 bodies, twisted and stained, one in a gas station uniform, lay inside. Their forms seared into my mind. There were 2 bodies in there, all bent out of shape with dark stains all over their clothes, and one of them was almost certainly wearing a gas station uniform. I stammered to the dispatcher, pacing, shock numbing me. They're in the dumpster. Jesus Christ, they're in the goddamn dumpster. I remember saying something like, oh Jesus, oh my God. I told her, they're in the dumpster. Jesus Christ, they're in the goddamn dumpster. I stumbled to the highway, vomiting, mindful of crime scene integrity, my stomach heaving as I ran. I'd run off near to the highway to puke up all the contents of my stomach, and I'd remembered that thing about preserving the integrity of crime scenes. Cops arrived, questioned me briefly, and let me go. The pump's hum fading as I drove away, forever changed. The cops arrived, and after talking to one of the officers for a few minutes, he told me I was free to leave. News reports mentioned my find, but no answers came. How or why they died remained a void, haunting my nights, driving me to shun silent stations, their pumps too quiet, too full of secrets. The pastor's justice, without a doubt. The biggest scandal to ever hit my small Arkansas town was a 9th grade girl ended up in the hospital after being attacked while walking home from school. The news hit like a thunderbolt, shattering the quiet of our sleepy community. The air turned thick with fear, every whisper carrying the weight of something unspeakable. Our town was a place where folks left doors unlocked, where kids roamed free until dusk. But that day, the world shifted, and the safety we took for granted vanished. The girl, barely a teenager, was found broken on a back road. Her injuries so severe, they shook even the hardest hearts. Something dark had crept into our town, and it wasn't leaving without a fight. Whoever attacked her hadn't just beaten the crap out of her. The brutality was beyond comprehension. A violation so vicious it required surgery to save her. They'd violated her to the point that she needed actual surgery to repair the damage. The doctor, a steady man known for his calm, stood before the press, his voice cracking. The doctor who performed the surgery broke down into tears during the press conference afterwards. He shared the good news. Her life was saved, but the weight of what he'd seen broke him. It was his job to tell everyone the good news, that the surgeries had been successful and her life had been saved. His tears were a mirror for our town's grief, a signal that nothing would ever be the same. Obviously, the next phase was trying to find the guy who did it. The girl's memory was a fog, her trauma blurring the face of her attacker. The victim's memory of the incident was hazy, and she couldn't give a detailed description of her attacker. Fear gripped us, neighbors eyeing neighbors, suspicion poisoning every glance. The streets, once alive with kids' laughter, grew silent, parents clutching their children close. The whole town descended into this total state of paranoia, trying to figure out who it was. State police led the hunt, their cruisers a constant presence, while local officers knocked on doors, pleading for leads. State police were running the investigation while local cops were going door to door or making visits to local schools to make appeals for information. Every shadow was a threat, every stranger a suspect, and the town held its breath, praying for answers. Our town wasn't used to this. We'd never known anything like it either. A speeding ticket was headline news, gossiped about over coffee for weeks. Someone's getting a speeding ticket around here, and it's all people are gossiping about for maybe weeks. This crime was a seismic shift, a wound that wouldn't heal. So to go from low crime to woe crime, well, that was quite something. Churches filled with prayers for justice, for the girl, for the monster to be caught. But justice, it seemed, had its own plans, darker and swifter than any of us expected. Out of the blue, a local pastor walked into a 17-year-old son's bedroom and shot him point blank in the head. The act was sudden, shattering the town's fragile calm. The pastor, a man of God, known for his sermons on forgiveness, had crossed a line no one could fathom. It was his wife, the boy's mom, who called the sheriffs on him, and she was still there, screaming bloody murder when the deputies showed up to arrest him. Her cries echoed through the night, a mother's anguish tearing at the heart of our community. The pastor didn't resist. He surrendered, calm as death itself, and walked to the cruiser without a word. His silence was louder than the gunshot, a mystery that would haunt us all. He just let those boys cuff him, and then he walked with him to their cruiser, and off he went. At the station, he laid it all bare. Down at the department, the guy made a full confession, told them the whole chain of events. 2. He described the argument with his son, the descent to the gun safe, the cold weight of the pistol in his hand. He and his boy had been talking and had come to a disagreement. He detailed every step, downstairs, upstairs, the shot. The pastor then walked downstairs, took a pistol out of his gun safe, and then walked back upstairs and shot him. He named the gun, the caliber, Every fact but one. He told them what gun he used, the caliber of the bullet, everything except why he did it. The deputies asked him over and over what it was he and his boy disagreed over, and why it was so bad the pastor felt he had to shoot him afterwards. They pressed, rephrased, guessed, but he wouldn't budge. No matter how many times they asked, no matter how many times they phrased the question or threw out guesses, the pastor wouldn't say what caused it. He only repeated his guilt, asking for jail. He simply repeated that he did it and asked to be taken to jail. His silence was a wall, unyielding, hiding a truth we all felt but couldn't prove. Officially speaking, no one knows why the pastor killed his boy. The records are blank, the case closed. But we knew, off the record, we all know why. And it's the reason the girl's attacker was never caught. The timing wasn't coincidence. The pastor's son, a quiet boy, was the shadow we'd been hunting. The town whispered it in diners, in church pews, a truth too heavy to say aloud. The only thing that really remains a mystery to everyone is how the pastor found out. No confession, no evidence, just a father's certainty, a knowledge born of something deeper than words. Because outside of a straight-up confession, it's hard to imagine how a father might come to learn something like that from his own flesh and blood. Some said the boy broke down, others that the pastor saw it in his eyes. Guilt, raw and undeniable. The town split. There's a lot of speculation around here. Some called the pastor a hero, a man who did what the law couldn't. Some of it good-natured, a lot of it not so good-natured. Others saw a monster, a father who betrayed his own blood. The girl's family stayed silent, their pain private, while the pastor's wife left town, her grief a ghost trailing her. It also doesn't seem to bother people that they'll never know how the pastor figured out his boy was the one that attacked that little 9th-grade girl. Justice, however brutal, was served in their eyes, because however it happened, some folks around here are very much of the opinion that the pastor did the right thing in putting his boy down. The town moved on, but the scar remained. A story told in hushed tones. I've thought about it for years. How does a man know? And what does it cost to act on it? The pastor's in prison, his life a shadow of sermons past. The girl healed, they say, but healing doesn't erase. The town's quiet again, but it's not the same. Every back road feels heavier, every stranger's glance sharper. I walk past the church sometimes, its steeple stark against the sky. I wonder what the pastor saw in his son's eyes, what truth broke him. The mystery lingers, a knot no one can untie. Some say justice was done, others say it was vengeance. I don't know, but I know the town will never forget the pastor's justice, or the silence that followed. The red car's secret, Union City, Tennessee, was a quiet town. Its streets lined with modest homes, its air heavy with the hum of small-town life. But beneath its calm lay shadows that whispered of secrets. On a warm afternoon, 4-year-old Marlena Childress played in her front yard, her laughter a fleeting spark in the dusk, her toys scattered like dreams on the grass. Her mother, Pamela Bailey, stood at the kitchen sink, her hands in suds, her eyes on her daughter, until a screech of tires shattered the peace. A red car with Kentucky plates roaring down the street, its speed a warning, its shadow a thief. Marlena was gone, the yard empty, the air thick with dread. A mother's heart breaking in the silence. The town was a patchwork of fields and faded dreams, its people bound by routine, its borders brushing Kentucky's edge, a place where strangers stood out, where a red car's haste was a scar on the day. Pamela's home was small, its windows wide, its kitchen a watchtower where she guarded her children. Marlena, her bright-eyed daughter, and Damon, her infant son, the stepbrother, Jerry, had left hours before. His mother's car, a familiar hum. But Marlena stayed. Her toys a world, her laughter a shield. Until the car came, its roar a predator's cry, its plates a clue that burned in Pamela's mind. Pamela's panic was a storm, her feet pounding the grass, her voice a scream that echoed unanswered. The yard was bare, the street deserted. The red car, a ghost that vanished into the haze. Its McCracken County plates, a taunt, a lead, a hope. She'd seen it before, hours earlier, at a gas station, where Marlena, candy in hand, had run ahead. Her joy a magnet for a man who loomed over her, his words soft, his eyes sharp. Pamela had chased him off, her mother's instinct a blade. But his red car lingered, its plates a memory, a shadow that now held her daughter, a truth she couldn't face. The town stirred, its people gathering, their whispers a chorus of fear, of doubt, of judgment. Pamela called the police, her voice breaking, her story spilling. The car, the man, the gas station, the screech of tires, the empty yard. The officers moved fast, their sirens a pulse, their search a race against the fading light. But the red car was gone, its driver a specter, its purpose a riddle. Marlena's absence was a wound, her toys a silent cry, her mother's guilt a weight that crushed, a town's hope a flicker in the dark, a mystery that began with a car, a secret that wouldn't stay buried. The gas station was a memory, its lot a stage where Marlena's joy had met a stranger's gaze, his words a lure, his retreat a lie. Pamela replayed it, her scolding soft, her daughter's tears a mirror to her fear, the red car's departure a warning she'd missed. The town was small, its secrets few, but the car was foreign, its plates a clue to McCracken County, a place across the state line, a world away. The police followed, their questions sharp, their search relentless. But the man was calm, his home empty, his story smooth, a truth that slipped through their fingers, a red car's secret that held Marlena's fate. On Thursday, April 16th of 1987, 4-year-old Marina Childress was playing with her toys out in her family's front yard. Marina lived in Union City, Tennessee, with her 22-year-old mother, Pamela Bailey, along with her stepfather, Johnny, and her 4-month-old half-brother, Damon. Also attending the house that day was Marina's 7-year-old stepbrother, Jerry, who was present until he was picked up by his mother at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. At around 3:30 p.m., with Marina still playing in the front yard, her mother washed dishes while watching her daughter through the large double-hung kitchen window. Pam looked down for mere moments, scrubbing and rinsing a few dishes, until she heard the screech and skidding of car tires coming from the street outside. She looked up and saw a red vehicle with Kentucky license plates speeding down the street and away from her home. The town was quiet, its streets a map of loss, but the car was a scar, its roar a thief, its shadow a truth that held Marlena's fate. A mother's cry unanswered, a mystery that began in the light, a secret that grew in the dark. The screech of tires was a wound in Pamela's memory, the red car's shadow a ghost that haunted her waking hours, its Kentucky plates a clue that burned like fire. At first, Pam simply shook her head and returned to her work. The dishes clinked, the suds a fleeting comfort. But the silence that followed was wrong, a void where Marlena's laughter should have been. Yet, seconds later, she was hit with a terrifying realization. Her heart lurched, her hands froze, the window a frame for an empty yard, a truth that choked her, a panic that drove her outside. She peered through the window again. The grass was still, the toys abandoned, Marlena's absence a scream in the quiet. Then, as a choking panic erupted in her chest, she rushed outside into her front yard to find that little Marina was nowhere to be seen. Her voice broke, her calls unanswered, the neighbors stirring, their faces a mirror to her fear. The street was empty, the red car gone, its speed a taunt, its plates a riddle. Pamela's mind raced, the gas station flashing back, the man's shadow looming over Marlena, his words a lure, his car a match for the one that fled. Following a frenzied search of the surrounding area, Pamela rushed to contact the police. She strongly suspected that her 4-year-old daughter had just been abducted by someone driving a red car with Kentucky license plates specific to McCracken County in the state's far west. Her voice trembled, her story spilling. The screech, the car, the man at the gas station, a connection too vivid to ignore. Not just because it was seen speeding down the street, but because someone driving the exact same vehicle had approached her daughter at a nearby gas station just hours before she went missing. The police listened, their notepads filling, their radios crackling. A search launched across state lines, a hunt for a child, a red car, a truth that slipped away. The gas station was a wound, its lot a stage where Marlena's joy had met a stranger's gaze, his presence a flicker of menace. After soliciting to the kid's demands, Pam had taken Marina and her brother Jerry to a nearby gas station to pick up some candy. Marlena's excitement was a spark, her candy a small victory, her run to the car a child's freedom. After obtaining her sweet treats, and in her excitement to return home, little Marina ran out of the store following her mother's purchases with the goal of being the first back to the car. Pamela followed, her voice sharp, her eyes catching Marlena's pause, the man's shadow towering, his words soft, his intent a shadow. Pamela quickly followed her daughter out into the gas station's parking lot, calling out to her as she went, only to find her staring up at a man she didn't recognize. Her heart raced, her steps a shield, the confrontation brief but fierce. The man leaned forward, towering over the frightened child, and began talking to her. His voice was calm, his excuse quick, his retreat a lie that lingered. But when confronted by Pamela, he excused himself and walked away. Pamela's scolding was gentle, her fear a storm, Marlena's tears a mirror to her mother's dread. Pamela gently scolded little Marina and told her not to go rushing off like that in public places. Then, as her tearful daughter apologized, Pam traced the strange man's path and saw him climbing into the driver's seat of a red car with McCracken County plates. The police moved fast, their search a race against time, their suspect a man in McCracken County, his home a stage for answers. Officers from the Union City Police Department rushed to apprehend their suspect and tracked him down to his old Kentucky home. He was calm, his surprise a mask, his story smooth. He seemed surprised by their arrival, admitted to having talked to the little girl at the gas station back in Tennessee, and even consented to a brief search of his home to confirm Marina wasn't there. The house was empty, his alibis checked, his name cleared, but the red car lingered, its shadow a truth, a clue that faded, a mystery that grew in the dark. A mother's hope, a flicker. A town's fear, a pulse that didn't stop. The red car's shadow was a scar on Union City. Its Kentucky plates, a riddle that haunted the police. Their search a desperate hunt for Marlena, a child lost in the dusk. Police all but ruled him out as a suspect. And after extensive interviews with Marina's stepfather, as well as her biological father, they too were cleared of suspicion. Johnny, Pamela's husband, was a quiet man, his alibi solid, his grief a mirror to Pamela's. Marlena's biological father, distant but cooperative, offered no clues, his life a separate thread, his name a but erased from doubt. The investigation stalled, its leads cold, its hope a flicker in the dark. The investigation continued for another 6 weeks, with police becoming more and more exasperated with the lack of progress. Until one day, a deeply shocking confession rocked the local community. The town buzzed, its whispers a storm, its eyes on Pamela, a mother broken by loss, now accused of a crime too dark to fathom. On June 8th of 1987, Pam was talking with a private investigator named Stan Caves. Caves, hired by Pamela's family, was a shadow in the case, his questions sharp, his recorder a silent witness. Caves had been hired at the beheads of Pam's family, who were frustrated with the tepid progress of investigating police. Then, one day, he and Pamela were conducting a tape-recorded interview. The room was small, its air heavy. Pamela's voice a thread, her words a confession that stunned. Pamela began talking about the day Marina went missing and how her misbehavior was becoming increasingly unmanageable. Marlena's tantrums, her defiance, were a weight. Pamela's stress a tide that broke. Marina's behavior got worse and worse while Pam got more and more stressed. The kitchen was a stage, its tiles a witness. Pamela's patience a fraying rope. Then, finally, after a bout of near-riotous misconduct, Pamela snapped, spun around, and struck her daughter on the back of the head. The blow was a thunderclap, its force a tragedy. Marlena's small body faltering. She hit with such force that little Marina wobbled, took a tumble, then struck her head on the corner of a nearby table as she fell. The table's edge was sharp, its wood a weapon, Marlena's temple a fragile shield. Pamela rushed to her daughter's aid, but was horrified to discover that smashing her temple against a pointed wooden corner had suddenly and quite definitely killed her. The silence was a scream, Pamela's hands shaking, her daughter's stillness a truth she couldn't face. Pamela continued her confession, fully aware that she was being recorded, telling Caves that once she realized Marina was dead, she'd hidden her body in the trunk of her car. The trunk was a tomb, its metal cold, Marlena's body a secret Pamela carried alone. She then drove said vehicle to the nearby town of Martin, where she contacted a family friend named P.L. Summers and arranged to meet him at a bridge on Campground Road. The bridge was a shadow, its planks creaking, the Obion River below a silent witness. There, they carried the dead girl's corpse from the trunk of Pam's car and then tossed it into Wyan River. The water swallowed, its current slow, its depths a vault for Marlena's fate. A truth Pamela's voice laid bare. Investigator Stan Caves was stunned, his breath caught, his questions sharp, his duty clear. He asked Pamela to confirm that what she was saying was the truth. Her nod was a weight, her tears a confession seal. Then, when she nodded, he informed her of his obligation to inform the police. Pamela's voice broke, her understanding a whisper. On the tape, a tearful Pamela states that she understands. Then, Cabness pushed a button, and the recording ends. Caves acted fast. His call a lifeline. The police a storm. Cabnes immediately contacted the Union City Police Department, with whom he'd already been working closely with, and informed them of Pamela's shocking confession. Pamela was arrested. Her confession a chain. Her daughter's fate, a truth that shook the town. A mystery that deepened. A red car's shadow a lie. A river's silence, a secret that held fast. Pamela's confession was a thunderbolt. Its words a wound that tore through Union City. Its truth a shadow that darkened her name. She was subsequently arrested on charges of second-degree murder, and a team of highly trained police divers were sent to troll the Oyan for any trace of Marina's remains. The Obion River was a quiet giant, its waters slow, its banks a stage for hope, for answers. Divers plunged, their search relentless, their mission clear. But the river was silent, its depths a vault, Marlena's body a ghost that wouldn't be found. But this is where the case becomes as vexing as it is chilling. The town held its breath, its people watching, their whispers a chorus of doubt, of fear, of judgment. Tennessee's Oyan River is a relatively slow, moving and meandering watercourse. Its current was gentle, its surface calm, a mirror to the town's unease. Heavy rains can temporarily increase its speed and water level, particularly in the winter and spring when rainfall increases. But the rains had passed, the river steady, its secrets close. But in its natural state, much of the Oyan consists of slow-moving waters, especially in the lower stretches where it flows at a much more leisurely pace as it approaches the Great Mississippi. According to Pamela, she and her friend had tossed her late daughter's body into the water during the small hours of April 17th, a time when most of the spring rains had come and gone. The timing was precise, the river's state known, its shallows a promise of discovery. This meant that by early June, a team of divers would most certainly have been able to recover any human remains holes that were tossed into the Oyan just 2 months prior. The search was thorough, its days long, but the river yielded nothing. No trace, no bone, no truth. But strangely, despite an intense search that spanned multiple days, not a single trace of Marina's body could be found. The absence was a riddle. Pamela's confession a lie, or a truth twisted by grief, by fear, by something darker. Curious regarding the inconsistency in her story, homicide detectives visited Pamela whilst in custody and asked her to confirm the location of the dumping site. Her cell was cold, her eyes hollow, her voice a thread. It was here that Pamela once again shocked investigators by recanting her entire confession. The words spilled, her story shifting, the river a fiction, the confession a dream. Pamela explained that just days prior to the tape confession with Stan Caves, she'd been released from a psychiatric hospital. Her mind was a storm, her grief a weight, her release a fragile hope. The stress of losing her daughter had been too much to bear. Marlena's absence was a wound, Pamela's sanity a fraying thread. So after a brief stay under the care of medical professionals, she was released having been prescribed a cocktail of antidepressants. The pills were a haze, her thoughts a fog, her confession a blur. Pam then claimed that not only had she been high as a kite during the taped conversation with Cabnes, but he'd heavily intimidated her prior to its recording, having used the threat of the electric chair to coerce a confession. Cave's voice, she said, was a blade. His threats a chain. Her words a lie forced by fear. A truth she couldn't hold. The detectives listened, their notepads filling, their doubts a pulse that grew. Pamela's story was a maze, her confession a trap, her recantation a key, or another lock. The river's silence was a witness, its emptiness a clue, a truth that slipped through their fingers. The town watched, its judgment sharp, its whispers a storm. Pamela, a mother, a suspect, a mystery. The red car lingered, its plates a shadow, its driver a ghost, a truth that haunted, a confession that broke, a river that kept its secrets, a child's fate, a puzzle unsolved, a mother's grief, a weight that didn't fade, a town's hope, a flicker in the dark. Pamela's recantation was a storm, her words a tide that washed away her confession, leaving Union City grasping for truth in the wake of Marlena's absence. Police then asked her what involvement, if any, her friend P.L. Summers had in her daughter's disappearance. Her voice trembled, her story shifting. Summers no longer a friend, but a shadow, a menace from her past. And Pam made yet another astonishing claim. The room was cold, her eyes distant, her accusation a blade that cut through the silence. Summers wasn't her friend. He'd been her lifelong abuser, and it was he that had abducted and murdered little Marina. According to Pamela, Summers' interest in her would wax and wane. His presence was a cycle, his demands a chain, his absence a fleeting peace. Sometimes he'd be a constant menace, demanding satisfaction whenever the mood took him. His voice was a threat, his touch a violation, Pamela's life a cage. Other times, he'd leave her in peace for months on end, but he always came back for more. The pattern was a trap, his return inevitable, his shadow a weight she couldn't escape. Then one day, after Summers called to arrange a date, she decided that enough was enough. Her resolve was a spark, her defiance a shield, her voice a weapon. Summers stopped by, but instead of giving in to him, Pamela fought off his advances and then threatened to call the police. The confrontation was fierce, her courage aflame, Summers' anger a storm. Summers' response was to threaten Marina's life. His words were venom, Marlena's name a curse, a promise of harm that chilled Pamela's soul. And then, a few weeks later, there's a screech of tires while she's washing dishes, and her little girl was gone. The red car, the screech, Marlena's absence, they were Summers' revenge. Pamela's confession a lie, her accusation a truth, or another twist in a maze of doubt. A decidedly puzzled pair of homicide detectives then paid a visit to P.L. Summers at his home. His house was small, its air stale, his face a mask of surprise. There they informed him of the accusations, and his reaction was incredulous. His voice rose, his denial sharp. Pamela's words a fiction he scorned. Summers categorically denied Pamela's shocking claim and retorted by painting her as a liar of pathological proportions. His story was clear, his contempt a blade, Pamela a shadow in his past. He stated he and Pamela had shared a brief dance many years ago, and that he didn't even know that she had a daughter, let alone kidnapped one of her. Police then asked Summers if he had an alibi for the day of Marina's abduction. His answers were quick, his alibis solid, his life a thread that didn't tangle. He responded by listing several, all of which proved credible when cross-referenced by detectives. The police checked, their questions thorough, their findings clear. Police had no choice but to rule Summers out as a potential suspect. His name was erased, his story a wall, Pamela's accusation a lie, or a truth buried too deep to find. The red car lingered, its plates a shadow, its driver a ghost, a truth that slipped away, a mother's claim a puzzle, a town's doubt a pulse that grew. The investigation faltered, its leads cold, its hope a flicker in the dark. Pamela's story was a maze, her confession a trap, her recantation a key, her accusation a lock. The town watched, its judgment sharp, its whispers a storm. Pamela a mother, a suspect, a mystery. Summers was free, his alibis a shield, but the red car's shadow was a scar, its screech a memory. Marlena's absence a wound that didn't heal. The police searched, their questions endless, their answers few. A child's fate, a riddle, a mother's grief, a weight, a town's fear, a truth that lingered, a red car's secret, a mystery that held fast, a hope that faded in the dark. Summers' denial was a wall, his alibis a shield, but Pamela's accusation lingered, a shadow that darkened Union City's quiet streets, a truth that pulsed in the town's unease. But here's where the story takes another unexpected turn. The investigation was a maze, its leads cold, its hope a flicker, until a new revelation broke the silence. Just months later, P.L. Summers was arrested on charges of molesting a 9-year-old boy. The news was a thunderclap, its truth a wound that tore through the town. Summers' mask shattered, his past a stain that couldn't be erased. An article from the Kentucky-based Paducah Sun, dated September 30th of 19, states that a 65-year-old named P.L. Summers was arrested the previous afternoon on charges of aggravated battery. The arrest was swift, the evidence damning, a child's trauma, a cry that reached the law. And what's more, Summers was arrested after a traumatized child approached their parents. The boy's words were raw, his fear a truth, his story a blade that cut through Summers' lies. He wasn't caught at the scene. It wasn't some kind of sting. Summers was visited at his home at around 4 hours after the attack. Unless the 9-year-old he was accused of molesting had a photographic memory and a talent for articulating the finer details of a person's appearance, it's safe to say that the police considered him a suspect due to his history of child abuse. The boy's testimony was clear, his pain a witness, Summers' past a shadow that grew. As it turns out, there was some degree of truth to Pamela's frightful claims, but the fate of her daughter remained a deeply troubling mystery. Her accusation, once dismissed, was a spark, a truth that burned, a clue that lingered, a red car's shadow, a pulse that didn't fade. Many police officers doubted Pam's story, and others doubted her sanity. But all agreed that without a body or any other kind of solid evidence, the chance of getting a conviction was highly improbable. The case was a maze, its truth a ghost, Pamela's confession a lie, her recantation a riddle, her accusation a key or a lock, free to move on with their life. Pamela Bailey found that she couldn't continue living in Union City and relocated to Mayfield, Kentucky, around 40 miles northeast of her childhood home. The move was a flight, her grief a chain, Mayfield a new start, or a shadow that followed. The town's whispers faded, its judgment deep, Pamela's name a scar, a mother whose daughter was lost, whose story broke. The red car was a memory, its plates a clue, its driver a ghost, a truth that slipped away. Summers' arrest was a twist, his crime a stain, but Marlena's fate was a void, a puzzle unsolved, a mystery that haunted the town. Pamela's life in Mayfield was quiet, its streets a refuge, but her grief was a weight, her daughter a dream, a truth that didn't fade. The police moved on, their files a tomb, their questions unanswered, their hope a flicker. The Obion River was silent, its waters a mirror, its depths a vault. Marlena's body a ghost that didn't rise. Pamela's confession was a lie, or a truth twisted by pain. Her accusation a spark, or a flame that died. Summers was a shadow, his crime a clue, but his alibis held. His name a wall, a truth that buried Marlena deeper. The town was a stage, its people a chorus, its fear a pulse, a child's absence a wound, a mother's story a maze, a red car's secret a mystery that grew, a hope that lingered in the dark. The years passed, Pamela's life a thread, her grief a weight, her move a shield against the past. But Marlena's shadow was a truth, a child's laughter, a dream, a mother's pain, a pulse that didn't stop. The red car was a scar, its plates a riddle, its driver a ghost, a truth that waited, a mystery unsolved, a town's doubt a chorus, a child's fate a secret that held fast, a hope that faded in the quiet. Mayfield, Kentucky, was a quiet haven, its streets a refuge from Union City's whispers. But Pamela's grief was a shadow that followed, Marlena's absence a wound that didn't heal. 2 years later, sometime in early 1990, Pamela gave birth to a son that she named Casey. Casey was a spark, his laughter a light, his presence a hope in Pamela's dark, a new thread in a life torn by loss. And for 12 long years, they lived in peace and harmony. Mayfield's calm was a balm, its days steady, Pamela's love for Casey a shield, a truth that held fast. Then, on April 22nd of 2002, just a few months after Casey's 12th birthday, Pamela told her young son that she had a surprise for him and asked him to put on a blindfold. Casey's eyes lit, his trust a child's gift, his blindfold a game, a promise of joy. Casey did as she was told before his mother led him out to the car and helped her son into the passenger seat. The car hummed, its engine a pulse, Pamela's silence a weight, Casey's questions a chatter in the dark. 6 days prior marked the 15th anniversary of Marina's disappearance. The date was a scar, Marlena's memory a ghost, Pamela's grief a tide that surged unseen. Pamela drove her son all the way to the mystery destination she'd picked out, then carefully helped him from the passenger seat and led him off into the unknown. Casey's steps were light, his blindfold a game, his mother's hand a guide, the grass soft under his sneakers. Casey kept asking if he could take off the blindfold yet. His voice was eager, his joy a child's hope. A surprise awaited. A moment to share? His mother told him no, that he had to wait until the right moment. Pamela's voice was steady, her intent a shadow, a truth that hid in the quiet, a plan that grew in the dark. He felt grass soft and spongy under the soles of his sneakers. The air was cool, the world hushed, Casey's anticipation a spark, his mother's silence a weight. And then suddenly, she brought him to an abrupt pair. His steps stopped, her hand firm, the moment a hush, a secret unveiled. She told him to take off his blindfold. Casey's hands moved, his eyes wide, his joy a shock, a truth that froze him cold. When Casey did so, his first reaction was utter confusion. The cemetery was a sea of silence, its gravestones a chorus, its air heavy with loss. a place no child should stand. He believed his pleasure was taking him somewhere exciting, or a fun, potentially deadly, present for his belated birthday. Casey's hope was a mirage, his shock a wound, the cemetery's truth a blade. Instead, he looked around, wondering what in the world his mother was thinking when she suddenly noticed a clue leading to the purpose of their visit. A gravestone gleamed, small, child-sized, its word a whisper, son. Before him stood a single word etched into a small, child-sized gravestone. The word cut deep, its meaning a riddle. Pamela's face a mask, her eyes a storm, a truth unveiled. Casey turned to see his mother brandishing a knife. The blade flashed, her hand steady, her intent a shadow that screamed. He tried to run, but she grabbed his sleeve, stabbing once in the back of his neck and twice through the flesh at his shoulder. Casey's fear was a pulse, his movement a blur, his survival a spark. Thankfully, Casey's quick thinking and decisive action saved his life. His twists were swift, his wounds shallow, a shield against death. His dynamic movement meant that the stab wounds inflicted by his own mother were relatively minor. He broke free, his feet pounding, his voice a cry, a help found, a life spared, a hospital's care, a fleeting refuge, a mother's knife, a truth, a child's escape, a miracle, a mystery that deepened, a red car's shadow, a pulse that lingered, a truth that didn't fade. Casey's escape was a miracle, his wounds a scar, his survival a spark that lit Union City's memory of Marlena, a shadow that pulsed through Pamela's arrest. He escaped, sought help, and then fully recovered following a brief stay in a hospital. The hospital was a refuge, its lights a shield, Casey's recovery a hope, his mother's knife a truth that broke. Pamela was once again arrested on charges of harming one of her own children, but when questioned claimed that she had no memory of the event and must have blacked out for the duration. Her voice was hollow, her eyes distant, her claim a lie, or a truth twisted by pain, a mind unmoored by grief. She was subsequently charged with attempted murder, but after a period of legal wrangling, ended up pleading no contest to charges of second-degree assault. The courtroom was a stage, its verdict a chain, Pamela's plea a shadow, her guilt a truth. She received a 10-year prison sentence, but was released after serving just 2/3 of her time. The years were a blur, her freedom a weight, her past a pulse that didn't fade. And while she was in prison, police took the opportunity to reopen the investigation into the disappearance of Marina Childress. The files stirred, their pages a map, the case a maze, Marlena's fate a riddle unsolved. But despite their best efforts, they were unable to make any solid progress in their investigation. The leads were cold, the river silent, the red car a ghost. The truth a shadow that slipped away. Some detectives remained firm in their position that Pam, who had already admitted to harming one of her children, was responsible for Marina's death. Her knife, her confession, her grief. They were clues, a truth that burned, a mother's guilt, a weight. Others weren't so sure. The doubts were a pulse, the case a puzzle, Pamela's story a maze, her innocence a flicker, or a lie. The town was quiet, its streets a mirror, its people a chorus of doubt, of fear, of loss. Pamela's name was a scar, her children a wound, Marlena's absence a truth that didn't fade. Casey's survival was a spark, His story, a cry. A mother's knife, a shadow that darkened her past. The red car lingered, its plates a clue, its driver a ghost, a truth that haunted the case. The Obion River was silent, its waters a vault, its depths a secret that held Marlena's fate, a confession that broke, a recantation that twisted, a truth that slipped through the cracks. The police searched, their questions endless, their answers few. The case a maze of lies, of truths, of shadows. Pamela's confession was a lie, or a truth buried by pain. Her recantation a key, or a lock. Her accusation a spark, or a flame that died. Summers' arrest was a twist, his crime a stain, but his alibis held, his name a wall, a truth that buried Marlena deeper. The town's whispers grew, its judgment sharp, its fear a pulse, a child's loss, a wound, a mother's grief, a maze, a red car's secret, a mystery that grew. I stood in the town's memory, its streets a map, its people a silent cry, Marlena's laughter a ghost in the fields, her toys a shadow in the yard. The gas station was gone, its lot a memory, the man's face a flicker, his car a red blur that carried the day. Pamela's life was a thread, her grief a blade, her knife a truth that cut her son, her daughter a dream, a loss that haunted her. The police were shadows, their search a stone, their hope a flicker, a case that burned, a truth that faded, a mystery that held Marlena's fate. The curse of Carta. The air over Carta hung heavy, a suffocating stillness that clung to the skin as I walked the island's coastal paths, the Baltic Sea whispering secrets I couldn't grasp. The small town buzzed with a tension that wasn't wind or waves, a pulse beneath the surface that made my chest tighten. The fishermen's nets lay idle, their eyes darting with unease, while the wreckers' boats rocked with a restless energy. A shadow loomed, not cast by clouds, but born of a collective dread, its presence threading through the island, ready to unravel the fragile peace. The nature reserve at Hiumaya's heart seemed to watch, its trees swaying with a rhythm that didn't match the breeze, their branches a silent chorus of warning. I paused by the harbor, the scent of salt mixing with something acrid, a premonition that prickled my nerves. My heart thudded as the town's silence warped, a hum rising from the cobblestones, a sound that carried the weight of history. The isolation of Carta, cut off by sea and suspicion, amplified my fear. No escape, no ally. Just me and the brewing storm of human minds. Something was awakening, its intent a tide pulling us toward chaos. I leaned against a weathered wall, the island's history pressing in, when a shiver ran through me, a sense of eyes on my back, not from the gulls, but from the past. The air thickened, and a vision flashed, restless spirits rising from sunken wrecks, their anger a melody that echoed in the fishermen's warnings. My pulse quickened as the wreckers' laughter cut through, their defiance a spark in the dry tinder of tension. Carta was a powder keg, and the fuse was lit, its explosion a matter of when, not if. The harbor's edge trembled, the water lapping with an urgency that mirrored my growing dread. I felt a pull, a psychic weight dragging me toward the town's center, where the rift between wreckers and fishermen had widened into a chasm. The communist era's scars lingered, its control a ghost that fueled the unrest, and the witch's curse, a legend I dismissed, seemed to pulse in the air. The island was no longer a home. It was a stage for a drama about to erupt, and I was caught in its grip. The The streets of Karda grew quiet. Too quiet. The usual chatter replaced by a murmur of fear that crept into every corner. A cold draft swept through, carrying whispers of the dead, as if the town held its breath, awaiting the next act. My hand shook as I joined the locals, their eyes reflecting a shared terror, a belief in something beyond reason. The curse, real or imagined, was a force building within us, a storm of madness ready to break loose. My name is Marco, and I'm writing to you from Estonia. We have a really weird town here called Karda, where a lot of weird, scary stuff happened back in the 80s, and I think your viewers would be interested in hearing about it. I don't expect many of your American listeners to know where Estonia is, but that's not trying to clown on you guys, as they say. If you put a gun to my head and ask me to point to the state of Idaho on a map, I'd tell you to pull the trigger, and I'll never be convinced that Kalamazoo is a real place until I actually see it for myself. Now, my point being is that my geography of far-off places isn't all that great either. So, allow me to explain where Estonia is and what we're all about, and to put it very simply, Estonia is situated in Russia's armpit. It's not so much the armpit part, which makes that so bad because if Estonia was situated in Margot Robbie's armpit, I think that would be fantastic. But instead, we're in Russia's armpit with little Latvia to our south and freaky Finland to our north. They're freaks and they know it. Don't worry about calling them out on it. We're reserved, independent, and nature-loving people. And by that, I mean, we're a bunch of emotionally distant loners who love long hikes where we drink vodka and complain about the weather. Estonians are so terrible about talking about their feelings that if I asked, "How are you?" and you replied, "I'm good, thank you," I would consider that a deep heart-to-heart conversation, as if you have laid out your entire soul to me. If Estonia sounds kind of like a weird place, then my job is done because it is a weird place. It's always been a weird place because you have to be weird if you want to survive. Especially when you're a tiny country, trapped between the twin titans of Europe and Asia. The communist shadow deepened the island's strangeness. But from what I understand, things got even weirder when the communists took over. Estonia was communist from the 1940s until 1991. And we tried our best to resist the Russians, but there were too many of them. And after they installed Estonian communists as our government, they started to ethnically cleanse us from our own country. They sent out lots of people to Siberia for a variety of crimes, some real, some imagined, whilst importing native Russians to try and change the demographics. We went from 97% native Estonian to only 62% native Estonian by 1989. And everyone either worked in the factories or was enlisted into the army. And we became second-ass citizens in our own country. The secret police was everywhere. You couldn't even go to the beach without permission. And if you were caught watching anything but Russian TV, it was just like that guy in Parks and Rec saying straight to jail. It was a terrible time for us, a time of hatred and paranoia. And the closer we got to independence, the more frustrated and volatile people became. And none more so than in a small coastal town known as Karda. The town's industries fueled a growing divide. Kardla is the only town on the small island of Hiiumaa, which lies in the Baltic Sea. Most of the people there make their money from either fishing or tourism, because there's a big nature reserve in the center of the island. But the third of Karda's major industries is what's referred to in English as wrecking. Wrecking is basically when a team of divers strips a sunken shipwreck of anything valuable. And while it's not nearly as common as it used to be for coastal communities around the world, the waters around Hiiumaa were a hotspot for naval combat between Germany and Russia during World War II. There's a lot of money to be made in bringing back military salvage, but the practice caused a huge rift between Carda's wreckers and its fishermen. The fishermen all said that disturbing the drowned sailors' final resting places would bring bad omens to Carda. But then, especially during communist times, people were encouraged to dismiss such silly superstitions as relics of an oppressive past. The curse legend added to the tension. The government then paid much better wages for wrecking than fishing, which further widened the rift between those two groups. And for a prolonged period, I'm talking many years, there was a general feeling in town that something bad would eventually happen, either because of the hatred between the wreckers and the fishermen, because of the bad luck that the latter was bringing, or because of a third reason, the curse of the High A witches. Now, I don't believe in this kind of thing, but it's worth mentioning because a lot of people around High A do believe in it. And as we all know, believing can make a regular person do some very strange things. There's a local legend which says High used to be home to a coven of witches. Witches who would cast spells, shapeshift, or summon storms, especially to sink ships or cause bad luck to unwanted visitors. One story claims that many hundreds of years ago, a fisherman insulted a group of witches and they cursed his family. His descendants were then plagued by misfortune for generations. And since many of Carda's fishing families were descended from this very same family, the witch's curse was often alluded to following the sudden and tragic loss of a local fishing vessel. The psychic earthquake began with violence. Again, I don't believe in witches or giants or any stuff like that, but I do believe it's legends like that which contributed to what you might call cardless psychic earthquake. That might sound a little woo-woo to some, but I don't use the term in any kind of supernatural sense. What I mean is all that tension in the region was like the fault lines in an earthquake zone. It kept building up, and when it finally got released, it was very bad. It all happened in the space of just 1 week back in September of 1989. There's another reason to compare this to an earthquake, and that's how there was one big earthquake. Then, a handful of psychic aftershocks which followed, almost like echoes of the original incident. The first incident, the earthquake if you will, took place when a girl named Dasha Brova blew up a Russian cafe by flooding the kitchens with gas and then igniting it. The explosion took place towards the end of service on a Saturday evening. So, the restaurant was packed, and the kitchen staff was in the dining area enjoying some hard-earned vodka after work. And by the time they smelled the gas, it was too late. And when all was said and done, 14 people ended up in a hospital, some with life-threatening injuries, and 5 more ended up in the morgue. The shockwaves continued with more horror. The authorities were quick to blame anti-Russian sentiment and were ready to use it as an excuse to arrest dissident Estonians who were suspected of raising support for an independence movement. But when it was discovered that the perpetrator was none other than a 16-year-old Russian cocktail waitress, everyone in Carda was stunned. Dasha had no history of violent or destructive behavior. By all accounts, she was quiet, fairly popular, and she did well in school. But what caused a well-behaved, unassuming schoolgirl to suddenly want to blow herself up and take as many people as possible with her? Police were still trying to figure out what the hell had happened when just 2 days later, a Russian fishing boat worker swerved his car into a line of school children, all waiting for the bus to school. He was blackout drunk at 7:30 in the morning, and witnesses said it looked like he deliberately swerved into the kids after putting his foot down on the accelerator. The drunk must have knocked himself out after slamming into a wall because he stayed in his driver's seat until the police showed up to drag him out of it. But when they did, he was laughing. Everyone saw it, too. The police, the medics, all the members of the public running around trying to save the kids' lives. They all saw it clear as day, because when the drunk saw what he had done, he started laughing so hard that you'd have thought that he was about to piss his pants. The tragedy deepened with a family's betrayal. As they dragged him to the police car, the drunk was shouting on Vol.3 shitare, which is Russian numbers counting from 1 to 4. He was counting the number of children that he hit that weren't moving or crying or screaming. He was counting the ones that were dead. As you can imagine, the residents of Carta were in a state of shock. Within just 3 days, they had the restaurant explosion, then the 4 dead school children, and with many more injured. And the local medical clinic was completely full. So many of the kids had to be taken to the mainland for proper treatment. It was so shocking to people that it almost felt like a war had started. It felt like we were under attack from some unknowable force from the outside. But after the incident with the kids, people told themselves in typical Estonian fashion, well, now things can't get any worse. So, it's all uphill from here. But then things did get worse. There was a big funeral and vigil held for the school kids who lost their lives the morning that drunk decided to smash into them. Everyone in Carta was in attendance, at least almost everyone, because almost everyone being in the streets then, walking to the cemetery together. It made it very easy to figure out who was and who wasn't there. And the more people started to notice that one particular family was missing, the more they started to ask questions, and the more they started to become concerned. The final act pushed the town to the edge. A small group of people then went to check in on the absent family, only to make a truly terrible discovery. A boy of just 11 had convinced his little sister of around 7 to join him in murdering their mother and father. They woke up early. Then, while their parents were still in bed, they crept downstairs to their kitchen and retrieved a pair of very sharp kitchen knives. Then, they walked back upstairs into their parents' bedroom, then cut both their throats while they were still sleeping. Obviously, people don't just die if you cut their throats, especially if you don't get all the major blood vessels. So, instead of pumping out blood so fast that they were too weak to move or scream, the kids' parents tried frantically to both stop the bleeding and to stop their children from attacking them. But sadly, their efforts were in vain. They found the mother's corpse in the bathroom and the dad's in the kitchen downstairs. He passed out and died trying to reach the phone to call 03, which back then was the Soviet emergency number specifically for medical emergencies. And this marked the 3rd incident of multiple murders within just a week. The town's response was a descent into madness. Then instead of telling each other, "Cheer up, things can't get any worse," people began to wonder what the next thing would be. They went from shocked and saddened, but still stoic, to almost a full-on panic descending on their town. People wouldn't let their kids go to school. They refused to go to work or do anything remotely dangerous. It was like people were convinced that there was some kind of curse on the town, which there obviously wasn't. But that didn't matter, because if people believe something, they truly believe it, then they can act in all kinds of ways you never expect them to. The wreckers started to throw back some of the more valuable and precious things they'd kept from the great sunken graveyards they'd made their money from. They threw back medals, trinkets, all kinds of things, and in the middle of the night, some men walked out of their houses and tossed their trophies in the cardless harbor and watched them sink to the bottom, all in hopes that it would put the dead sailors' angry spirits to rest. Some of the fishermen, on the other hand, left offerings in the woods for the witches of Haya, who they firmly believed were behind all the horrifying going on. The storm subsided, leaving questions behind. It was like the vast majority of the people in town all fell victim to the sudden, all-consuming collective madness, one that made them lash out at each other and act in all kinds of bizarre ways. They kept waiting and waiting for the next terrible thing to happen. But thankfully for them, the psychic storm hovering over the town had finally abated. Again. I don't use that term in the literal sense, but to me, it's the only term that actually broaches on what happened during that 1 week back in 1989. Carta went from years and years without so much as a common assault, and then, during the space of just 7 days, a dozen people all lost their lives in a series of senselessly violent acts. It's almost enough to make a person believe in restless spirits or ancient Wiccan curses. But if you ask me, what's to blame is something that's in our programming as biological machines. Lines of code we've been running since the days we lived in caves, and the shadows cast monsters on the walls during long and uncertain nights. The island's scars lingered, a testament to human fragility. The week of 1989 left Carta a town of whispers, its streets haunted by the memory of violence. The restaurant explosion, the school children's deaths, the family murder, each a crack in the town's psyche, widened by the wrecker's defiance and the fisherman's fear. The offerings in the woods, the sunken treasures, were desperate acts of a community unmoored, their beliefs shaping a reality of panic. I walked those paths again, the air still thick with the echo of that week, a curse not of witches, but of minds pushed to the brink. The legend of the Hiumaa witches fueled the town's descent. Stories of their storms and spells, passed down through generations, found new life in the chaos, a scapegoat for the unrest. The fishermen's offerings, flowers, bread, vodka, were pleas to appease an imagined coven, while the wrecker's discarded loot was a confession of guilt. I pondered the fisherman's tale of the cursed family, its misfortune a mirror to Carta's plight, but dismissed it as folklore, blaming instead the psychological strain of oppression. The island's history, its isolation, had primed the town for this psychic break. The authorities' response only deepened the rift. The initial blame on anti-Russian sentiment shifted with Dasha's reveal, leaving the town grasping for answers. The drunk's laughter, the children's deaths, the siblings' betrayal, each act a symptom of a pressure cooker bursting, fueled by years of Soviet control. The medical clinic's overflow, the panic's spread, showed a community unraveling, their stoicism shattered. I wondered if the secret police's legacy had sown this discord, a harvest of fear reaped in 1989. The aftermath was a town transformed. The wrecker's return of salvage, the fisherman's rituals, were acts of atonement, a bid to restore balance. The panic faded, but the scars remained. Empty schools, silent harbors, a community forever changed. I spoke to locals, their stories blending fact and myth, the curse a convenient explanation for a week of madness. For me, it was a lesson in the mind's power, a psychic earthquake born of human tension, not ancient magic. The question of belief lingered. The witch's legend, the offerings, the violent acts, did they reflect a curse or a mind's breaking under pressure? I leaned toward the latter, seeing Carta's story as a case study in collective hysteria, its roots in communism's oppression. Yet, the island's eerie quiet, the fisherman's faith, left a doubt, a possibility that the past's spirits had whispered through the chaos, a melody of unrest I couldn't fully dismiss. The man who looked like Mark Bolan. The petrol station was a quiet island in the dawn, its fluorescent lights buzzing like a warning I didn't yet understand. As a student in Leeds, I worked the early shift, the hum of the till, and the occasional customer my only company. The job was a lifeline, fitting neatly around my uni lectures, but it left me alone in the stillness, vulnerable to the world's shadows. That morning, the air felt wrong, charged with a menace I couldn't name. A man walked in, his face a twisted echo of Mark Bolan, the rock star my dad adored. But this version was hollow, menacing, a predator in vintage rags. His eyes locked onto me, and I felt it, a chill, a promise of trouble I couldn't escape. What began as a routine transaction spiraled into a nightmare, his words carving fear into my bones. Why did his voice linger, threatening to return long after he was gone? I used to work morning shifts in a petrol station when I was at Loughborough Uni. The job was a grind but manageable, a good gig really. After the morning rush, the last 3 hours or so were usually quite quiet, letting me slip into the office to read between customers if the boss wasn't hovering. One morning, a man walked into the petrol station who had to be in maybe his 40s or 50s. His presence jolted me from my book. His appearance grabbed my attention right away because he was the spitting image of Mark Bolan from the cover of T-Rex's album Unicorn. My dad's old LPs had made Bolan's face familiar, a glamorous icon, but this guy that walked into the petrol station looked like his evil twin or something. He had the same mop of dark curly hair, the same dark, tired-looking eyes, but his face was gaunt, like a skeleton that someone had papier-mâchéd a thin layer of wet tissue paper on. His clothes, a sheepskin coat, a bright pink t-shirt, and what looked like blue bell-bottom jeans were tattered. They just made him look weird, smelly, and creepy. I usually didn't concern myself with people's appearances much. The station saw all types, and I'd serve anyone who paid and left. But this man, I think I'd rather it was Dracula who walked in that day, as opposed to Mark Bolan's evil twin. He grabbed a pint of milk from the fridge section, walked up to the counter, and asked for X amount of fuel on whatever pump it was. I processed his payment. I took his money, gave him his change, and then thanked him for his custom. Normally, customers would nod or say, "Cheers, love," and leave. But evil Bolan stayed by the counter, looked at me, and then said, "You're a pretty young lady, aren't you?" My skin crawled. To say my skin crawled would have been the understatement of the century. Compliments always made me uneasy, but his tone, oily, drawn out, was vile. As he was walking out, he drew out the very before pretty like, "You're a very pretty young lady, aren't you?" The "aren't you" squeaked, patronizing, like he was talking to a kid or something. I knew better than to talk back to a stranger like that. Risk wasn't worth it. So I said, "Thank you," in a polite but very reserved way, and moved away. Stepped away from the counter to make it look like I had work to do in the stockroom. It was a tactic I'd used before, a gesture that said, "I'd love to stop and chat, but duty calls." And usually, the men attempting to flirt with me took the hint. But he immediately asked, "Where are you going?" His tone shifted. There was just a hint of aggression creeping into his voice when he said it. I forced a smile, ready to mention a stock count, when he said, "Don't walk away from me. Trying to talk to you." My instincts screamed trouble. This guy's going to be a problem, isn't he? I explained. I started explaining that as much as I'd like to stop and chat, I had work to do, saying, "I'm on the clock," he shot back. "Well, I'm a customer," and insisted he didn't often get to talk to a girl as pretty as me. I deflected. I tried telling him that as much as I appreciated the compliment, I'd get into trouble with my boss. He dismissed it. Evil Bolan just waved away my concerns, and then told me, "I'll deal with your boss if he complains." Then, chillingly, he told me, "I wish I was as pretty as you." The words, slimy and leering, was just this whole new level of cringe for me. I bristled. The only thing that came to mind for me was to say something about how inappropriate that was in a professional setting, stating I didn't appreciate him commenting on my appearance. He laughed. The guy just laughed like this short chuckle and snort, and then asked me, "Don't you like being pretty?" I froze. I couldn't think of a response, trapped by his gaze. I just wanted to run into the stockroom, slam the door, but feared he might follow me. I held firm. I tried my best to stand my ground and repeated that I didn't appreciate his tone or his question, warning if he didn't leave the premises, I'd call the police. His aggression grew. He asked me, "What? You're really gonna call the bloody police just 'cause someone called you pretty?" I ignored him. I just asked him to leave and added some preemptive thanks. He pushed back. There was a bit more to and fro with him saying how he was a customer and wasn't going to leave. When I pulled out my phone as if to say, I really am about to call 999, he says this, "You know, if I looked like you, I'd just stay at home all day without a stitch of clothing on, just staring at myself in the mirror. That's still one of the most skin-crawlingly creepy things a man has ever said to me." Furious. I was so angry. I could have screamed, but I tried my very best to keep my cool and just asked him to leave again. He ranted. Bolan's evil twin started going off on one about how I needed to learn to take compliments, and then said he wished he got half the amount of attention that I did. A bizarre claim since he didn't even know me. He escalated. They started saying something about how depressed I'd be when I got older and lost my looks. He sneered I'd be a pathetic, undesirable waste of oxygen, and I'd end up sticking my head in an oven. I clenched my jaw. I just gripped my teeth and repeated myself for the nth time that he needed to leave. Then, his tone darkened. He said, "If you don't want the attention, if you don't like being pretty, then I can make you not so pretty if you want." The threat silenced me, but I brought up on my phone that I had dialed the police and connected. His voice changed almost completely to a very deep, guttural growl, vowing he could come over the counter and smash my face in until I didn't look like a person anymore. He taunted. My friends and family wouldn't recognize me when he was done, and I'd be as ugly on the outside as I was on the inside. As I spoke to the operator, there was a tremor in my voice as I started telling the operator what was happening. The situation overwhelmed me. It was probably one of the more stressful experiences of my entire life. Balancing fear, I was watching Bolan's evil twin to make sure he didn't jump over the counter, and focus. I had to concentrate on giving all the necessary info to the police. It was excruciating. It was like total cerebral overload. His words grew grotesque. He said something like, "I'd love to cut your face off and wear it." While I heard that, the operator's assurance, "Police are on their way," snapped me. I started screaming at that guy, telling him how the police were on their way, how he was going to get nicked. Only then did he start making his way towards the door. But he had a load of stuff about how he'd be back the next day to teach me a lesson in manners. The police arrived swiftly. The police were there in minutes. I showed the CCTV footage, and as soon as I did, one of the officers instantly recognized the man who had been harassing me. His name was Charles, or Chaz, but that he sometimes told people his name was Alexei Bowie. I clarified he hadn't told me his name. The officer revealed this was something Chaz did a lot. Leeds police had already received several complaints regarding Chaz's habit of harassing lone women. He targeted those who couldn't escape. It was like his thing. He was just weeks away from being arrested and charged, pending CPS approval, likely facing prison. I couldn't have asked for a better outcome. I never saw that Chaz again around the station or town, a good indicator that he'd finally got what he deserved. I quit soon after, the station's quiet hours now menacing. I checked CCTV obsessively, fearing his return. but he was gone. I researched his name, finding no trace, but locals knew him, a drifter with a history of terrorizing women. The experience scarred me. I avoid late shifts, carry a whistle, and scan faces for his gaunt sneer, wondering if he's out there, waiting for another chance to make someone not so pretty. The stranger at North Star Mart. The North Star Mart stood alone on a quiet stretch of rural Virginia highway, its neon sign flickering against the night sky. Ethan, a college student working the graveyard shift, leaned back in the office chair, the hum of the gas pumps a distant lullaby. The store was empty, as it often was at this hour, but the darkness outside felt heavier tonight. He glanced at the security monitors, their grainy feeds showing the pumps and store entrance. When a figure appeared on the screen, a man seen approaching from the shadows. Ethan's pulse quickened. Something about the man's slow, deliberate stride set his nerves on edge. The stranger stopped just outside the door, motionless under the camera's gaze. He wore faded jeans, work boots, and a baseball cap, the kind of guy you'd pass without a second thought. But then his head turned, locking eyes with the camera lens, and Ethan felt a chill, as if the man was staring through the screen, straight into his soul. Ethan's hand hovered over the phone, Judd's rule echoing in his mind. Call if anyone acts weird. This was beyond weird. It was wrong. A quiet menace that made the air in the office feel thick. He dialed Judd, his heart pounding, unsure what scared him more, the man outside or what Judd's reaction might reveal. Moments later, Judd burst through the door, shotgun in hand, his face a mask of fear. The stranger had vanished, but Judd's terror lingered, his eyes fixed on the monitor as he rewound the footage, confirming a truth that sent Ethan running from the job and Foster forever. I used to work nights at a gas station called North Star Martel, near a place called Foster in rural Virginia. Ethan, a 20-year-old student, drove from Gloucester to work the night shift at North Star Mart, a small but vital hub for locals. Judd lived right next door to the gas station in a big old house that he claimed that he built himself. Judd, the owner, lived in a sprawling house next door, boasting he'd built it single-handedly, a claim Ethan doubted but never challenged. There was no way that he built that whole thing on his own, but he was far too nice for me to call him out on it, so I just let it be. Judd was an exceptional boss, protective and fair, a rarity Ethan cherished. He was a great boss, too. I mean that from the bottom of my heart. Not many folks can say that they had a boss who had done almost anything to keep him safe, but I can. Yet, guilt gnawed at Ethan for avoiding Foster since quitting. The memory of that night too raw. And it makes me feel a little guilty sometimes that I don't head up there to visit him more. But I don't like driving around Foster anymore. I don't like going anywhere near the place. For nearly 10 months, Ethan worked 2 to 5 nights a week, balancing school and the job. I worked at the North Star for 9 months and 3 weeks, working anything from 2 to 5 nights a week, depending on how busy I was at school. Customers were polite, never causing trouble, making it one of Ethan's best jobs. Not a single customer in all the time I worked there ever gave me a single ounce of trouble. It was one of the best jobs I ever had in that respect. Weeknights were quiet, with only a handful of customers, leaving Ethan time to watch movies on his iPod. It was always a little busier on weekends, but during weeknights, I'd sometimes serve only 2 or 3 customers a night and spend the rest of my time watching movies on my iPod. Judd was lenient, assigning no busy work, only one firm rule: call him if anyone acted strangely. Judd was really chill like that. He didn't give me a bunch of cleaning tasks, and he didn't give me any busy work at all. actually, and he only ever had one rule. If anyone ever showed up late at night acting weird in any way, I was to call him right away. Ethan agreed, though it felt slightly belittling, trusting Judd's concern for the station, his life's investment. It didn't matter if the call woke him and his wife up from the sweetest dreams they'd ever had. If anyone was acting sketch, Judd wanted to know about it. I figured that was fair enough. The gas station was Judd's whole life. It was his retirement plan. Initially, the rule made Ethan uneasy, hinting at potential dangers. But months passed without incident. When he first told me about his little golden rule, I'd be lying if I said that it didn't make me a little nervous. I guess it suggested that there were a lot of weird people who came by the gas station at night. But that couldn't have been further from the truth. Only once had he called Judd. When a woman screamed wildly near the pumps, later identified as a harmless drunk. I guess it's not entirely true that nothing weird ever happened, because there was one previous occasion where I called Judd in the middle of the night. Some crazy lady was screaming like a demon out near the pumps. Judd reassured him it was just Rhonda liquored up on payday, and she soon left. I told him about the lady and how her screaming was freaking me out. He asked for a description. I gave him one, and then he tells me, "Oh, that's just Rhonda liquored up on payday. She'll head home once she's tired herself out." And then, you know what? She did. Then, one night, everything changed. And then one night, it happened. Ethan was in the back office, watching the dark night rises and glancing at the monitors, when a man appeared. I was in the back office one night, splitting my attention between security monitors and a copy of The Dark Knight Rises, when I suddenly saw a lone figure approaching the gas station. The 3 cameras showed the pumps, store approach, and interior. We had 3 cameras, one facing the pumps, one facing the approach to the store, and a third which allowed me to watch the inside of the store from the back office. The man, unremarkable in jeans, boots, and a hunting cap, walked past the pumps but stopped outside the door. I can see the guy walking towards the store past the pumps and then into the view of the second camera. But then, instead of walking into the store like literally everybody else, he stops dead outside the door. He's right in the view of the second camera, so I'm looking at this guy fairly close up, and he looked like a perfectly regular rural Virginia dad type. He looked like he had work boots on, some faded jeans, and a baseball cap with some kind of hunting or fishing logo on it. Literally the most unremarkable looking guy that could ever walk through our door. His stillness was unnerving, but his behavior most definitely got my attention. As Ethan watched, the man's head turned slowly, staring into the camera, chilling him. Anyway, the guy in the sporting goods cap stopped dead and just stood there in front of the camera, not moving a muscle. But then, as I'm watching him, his head starts slowly moving, turning his neck until he's staring into the camera lens. I know it was just an illusion, but it felt like he was staring directly at me. And that was easily one of the most unnerving sensations I've ever experienced. Ethan called Judd, fear overriding pride. Once the guy's behavior reached a concerning level of weird, I grabbed the phone and called Judd. I didn't even feel emasculating doing it either. This wasn't a typical disturbance. It felt malevolent. Whatever that guy's problem was, it wasn't meth. It was something way scarier than that. Judd answered, asking for a description, but slammed the phone down mid-sentence. Judd picked up the phone. Then, once again, he asked me to describe the person acting weird. I started describing the guy, and then the next thing Judd slams the phone down, the man vanished from the monitors, not entering the store. I look back at the screen, and the guys disappeared from view. But he's not in the store either. Judd appeared on the monitors, running from his house in boxers, clutching a shotgun. So, I was wondering what was so different about that time when I suddenly see him on the monitors. Judd was running towards the gas station in nothing but his boxer shorts and a wife beater, and he was carrying a shotgun in his hands. He burst in, demanding the man's whereabouts. He bursts into the store and asks me where he is. Ethan, stunned, said the man had left. Then, when I say the guy just disappeared and that I think he just walked off, Judd runs past me into the office to check the monitors. Judd ignored Ethan's questions, focusing on the footage. I'm freaking out. Too. Because what the hell is he carrying that shotgun for? But no matter how many times I asked him what's going on, he kept silencing me and telling me that I needed to concentrate as he ran back to the security footage to get a look at the guy's face. When he found the frame, Judd paled, terror evident. I watched him rewinding the footage until he finally found what he was looking for. And when he did, I watched Judd turn completely pale. His fear was palpable, amplifying Ethan's own. Whoever it was, Judd was terrified of him. So terrified that he felt the need to come running over with a shotgun to protect me. And then that scared the hell out of me. 2. Judd sent Ethan home after calling the police. Judd sent me home that night after calling the cops. The next day, Judd offered to let him quit without judgment. And the next day, he called to say that he'd understand if I didn't want to come back to work. Ethan asked about the man, but Judd evaded, repeating his offer. I asked just one time if he could tell me who the man was, and Judd paused and then repeated the part about understanding if I didn't want to come back. Ethan resigned, thanking Judd, but unable to continue. I thanked him for the job, wished him luck, and then just hung up. Guilt lingered for not visiting Judd, but fear kept Ethan away. Like I said earlier, I still feel guilty about not going up to see him more. He was a great guy and a great boss. The unknown man's identity and Judd's terror made the job untenable. But without knowing who that guy was, without knowing why Judd was so scared of him, I couldn't put myself in the position of working for him anymore. I didn't want to die for some stupid gas station job, no matter how cool my boss was. If someone could terrify Judd, a tough man, Ethan felt powerless. And if there was a guy out there who scared the hell out of one of the toughest sons I'd ever known, then what chance in hell did I have? The drive home that night was a blur. Ethan's mind replaying the man's stare, Judd's panic, the shotgun's glint. He never returned to North Star Mart, the station now a place of dread, its neon sign a beacon he avoided. Ethan moved on, finishing school and finding new jobs, but Foster became a no-go zone. He checked local news for clues about the stranger, finding nothing, the silence amplifying his unease. Judd's face, pale and haunted, stayed with him, a reminder of a danger left unexplained. Ethan called once, years later, but Judd's guarded tone offered no answers, only a wish for Ethan's safety. Friends teased him about quitting over a creepy customer, but Ethan held back the full story, its weight too heavy. The man's cap, his deliberate pause, felt like a warning, one Ethan heeded by staying away. Now, Ethan shares his tale, a puzzle unsolved, a fear unshakable. The stranger at North Star Mart, whoever he was, left a mark, a shadow that lingers in the quiet of rural Virginia nights. The storm is refuge. The Nebraska sky was a canvas of endless blue, its vastness a promise of peace. But that day, it darkened with a fury that turned our gas station into a fortress. As a high school senior, I worked weekends at a rural gas station, a quiet outpost in Nebraska's open heart. I used to work weekends at a rural gas station here in my home state of Nebraska. The drive to work was my joy. The highway stretching past barns and windmills, the skyline unbroken under a summer sun. I love driving around Nebraska. You hit the highway from some small town, and it's like the whole world stretches out in front of you for as far as the eye can see. That afternoon, the sky was clear, wispy clouds drifting lazily. I set off to work with nothing but a few wispy clouds and a clear blue sky. But as I cruised along, dark clouds loomed on the horizon, a wall of anger that felt biblical, promising more than rain. As I drove along the highway that afternoon and looked off into the distance, I saw some really scary-looking storm clouds rolling in. My gut warned me this wasn't ordinary, a storm brewing that would test more than my shift. The clouds weren't just a threat, they were a reckoning, their shadow turning the station's hum into a prelude to chaos. Most storms in Nebraska look fierce, but pass with little fuss. A bit of wind and rain. The general rule is that most storm clouds look much scarier than they actually are, especially when there's that big wall of angry-looking clouds facing you down, like something straight out of the Bible. But this one felt different, its weight pressing as I pulled into the station. Something told me it was going to be a bad one. Radio alerts confirmed it, blaring storm warnings as I arrived. By the time I got to the gas station, the storm warnings were being sounded over by local radio stations. My coworker, Jake, and I skipped our usual handover, diving into preparations. My coworker and I normally did a quick handover, but since we got the storm warnings, we both had a hell of a lot more work on our hands. We locked windows, secured outdoor fixtures, and checked the pumps before shutting off the fuel. We had to lock all the windows, then either secure all of our outdoor fixtures or drag them inside. And then we had to inspect the pumps and all that kind of stuff before shutting off the fuel completely. Jake fueled the generator while I gathered flashlights and batteries, candles forbidden in our flammable world. My coworker went off to fuel up the generator just in case we lost power, as I went off to assemble a bunch of flashlights and batteries. The station wasn't just a workplace, it was a sanctuary. Its office, a shield against a sky that roared with vengeance. We prepped our shelter, the station's office, stocking the first aid kit and keeping the radio tuned for alerts. We already had our designated shelter lined up, the station's office. So, after ensuring the first aid kit was fully stocked, we kept the radio tuned up, expecting a quiet shift. We thought locals would hunker down. We figured people would stay home and we'd be in for a pretty turbulent but relatively lonely shift. But we were wrong. 3 cars arrived over an hour, their drivers seeking refuge. One by one, 3 cars rolled into the front over the course of about an hour. 2 driven by single people, and the other containing a mom and her 2 young daughters. 2 men, alone, and a young mom with her daughters. Their paths home blocked by the storm's fury. Wherever they'd been, the path home led directly through the storm, so they begged for shelter. We couldn't refuse, though our space was tight. We weren't exactly equipped to shelter that many people, but there was just no turning them away under these circumstances. We offered snacks and drinks to calm their nerves, the storm's howl growing outside, the radio crackling with static, as if it sensed the coming chaos. We let everybody help themselves to drinks and snacks if they were hungry, mainly to try and calm their nerves as the incoming storm got worse and worse. The storm wasn't just wind, it was a beast. Its roar shaking our refuge, debris flying like shrapnel, testing our fragile calm. The storm's wrath intensified, the sky black, until tornado sirens pierced the air, a sound that chilled us all. Did it get worse? And then we heard the sirens going off. The adults tensed, but the mom's daughters, young and terrified, screamed begging to go home. It scared the hell out of the younger woman's 2 daughters, who started screaming and crying and begging their mom to take them home. Debris struck a car outside, the alarm's wail fueling their cries, their fear raw and uncontainable. Then, when stuff started flying off of our roof, a piece of debris hit one of their cars, and the sound of the alarm made the kids cry harder. We rushed to the office, squeezing in, the siren's wail dulled by the walls, calming the girls slightly. It only took a few more moments of stuff falling off of our roof before we had room to fit everyone. And thankfully, with shielding us from the sound of the sirens, the 2 girls started to calm down. A crash shattered the store's window, glass exploding inward, the sound like a bomb, reigniting our fear. Something flew across the parking lot and smashed through the glass window and made a sound like a bomb exploding. The girls shrieked. One woman, Lisa, panicking, bolting for the door, her eyes wild with escape. The 2 little girls nearly lost their minds. One of the single drivers had some kind of panic attack and tried to run back to her car. The office wasn't just a room, it was a crucible where fear forged us together. Our voices a shield for the girls' fragile hearts. Jake lunged, shouting that outside was death, grappling with Lisa as she fought, her screams echoing the girls. My coworker lunged at her, telling her how going outside meant absolute death, and she wouldn't stop struggling. I and another driver, Sam, held her, her flails desperate until she collapsed, sobbing apologies. She tried to fight my coworker, screaming and flailing, and it took me and the other single driver to subdue her. Then she cried and told us over and over again that she was sorry. The girls' cries pierced us, their breaths ragged, and we focused on soothing them. Our stories and songs, a desperate bid to keep them calm. We rode out the storm together. I worked so hard at keeping them calm and reassuring them that we were all going to be just fine. We reassured ourselves, our voices trembling but united, the radio now humming faintly, as if mourning the storm's rage. I think we were all trying to reassure ourselves. 2. The winds died, and after an hour we emerged, the store trashed, glass and debris everywhere, the window's breaker unknown. The sounds of the winds died down. And after about an hour or so, it looked like it was safe. We walked into the store to find it absolutely trashed. The mom thanked us, her girls clinging to her as the others left. Jake and I stunned, staring at the wreckage, wondering what we'd survived. The folks thanked us before they got into their cars, especially the young mom. After that, everyone except me and my coworker went their separate ways, leaving me and him like, what in the hell did we just go through? Thank you for listening till the end. Vamos, if you hear a knock at 3 a.m. tonight, don't answer it. Maybe the next story is coming. Symbiotes for you. See you the Simpodas in your next nightmare.